Abigail Harper pressed her last coin into the station master's palm and turned to face her 4 sons lined up on that windswept Wyoming platform, like 4 reasons the world kept kicking her down. Ethan's jaw was set hard. Noah's bottom lip trembled. She had exactly nothing left. No money, no home, no husband, and one name scrawled on a crumpled paper. A man she had never met. A rancher who had answered a letter 12 others had thrown away. She straightened her spine, took Noah's hand, and walked toward whatever God had left for her. If this story already has your heart hit that subscribe button right now, ring the notification bell so you never miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter had taken Abigail Harper 3 nights to write. 3 nights of sitting at a table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, writing by a candle stub she kept relighting because she couldn't afford another scratching out sentences that sounded too desperate and rewriting ones that sounded too proud, until somewhere past midnight, on the 3rd night, she finally set the pen down and stared at what she had produced. It was honest. That was the best she could say about it. She told the truth about her age, 34, nearly 35. She told the truth about her situation, widowed going on 2 years. No property to speak of. No savings remaining. No family within 1,000 miles willing to take in a woman and 4 growing boys. She told the truth about her boys, Ethan at 16, Samuel at 13, Jacob at 10, and little Noah, who had just turned 6, and still sometimes woke in the night crying for a father who wasn't coming back. And she told the truth about herself. She wrote, "I am a large woman. I will not pretend otherwise because I have found that pretending leads only to worse disappointment later. I am strong. I am healthy. I cook well. I keep a clean house. I work hard from first light to well past dark, and I do not complain. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a partner who needs what I am able to give and who is willing to give my children a stable home in return." She sent that letter to 14 men whose names appeared in the matrimonial column of a Denver newspaper. 12 of them never wrote back. 1 wrote back a single line. "A woman of your description with 4 children is not what I require." The 14th, a Wyoming rancher named Luke Mercer, wrote back 3 paragraphs. He said he had been alone on his ranch for going on 5 years. He said the house was large and the land was productive, but that he had let things slide in ways he wasn't proud of, and that a woman with backbone and practical sense was worth more to him than any other quality he might have listed. He said he didn't care about her size. He said, and this was the part Abigail read 4 times before she believed she was reading it correctly, "I suspect a woman who raised 4 boys on her own through 2 years of widowhood without asking anyone for charity has more backbone than most men I have known. That counts for something out here. It counts for a great deal." He signed it, Luke Mercer, Mercer Ranch, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Abigail sat with that letter for 2 days. Then she wrote back and told him she would come. She did not tell Ethan where they were going until the morning she packed their belongings into a single trunk and 2 cloth bags. Ethan stood in the doorway of their rented room in Colorado Springs with his arms crossed and that expression on his face that had appeared the day they buried his father and had never fully left. "You're taking us to live with a man you've never met," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "I'm taking us somewhere we have a chance," Abigail said. She kept folding. She didn't look up. "Ma." "Ethan." "He could be anyone." "He could be," she agreed. "He could also be the only man in 14 who wrote back to me like I was a human being worth corresponding with. So we're going." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if he takes one look at you and changes his mind?" Abigail paused in her folding. She set down the shirt she was holding. She looked at her oldest son, this boy with his father's jaw and his father's stubborn eyes, and she felt a familiar ache move through her chest like a slow current. "Then we'll figure out the next step from there," she said quietly. "Same as we always have." Ethan uncrossed his arms. He picked up the heavy end of the trunk without being asked. They left Colorado Springs on a Thursday morning. The train ride to Cheyenne took most of the day. Jacob talked for the first 4 hours about everything visible from the window: cattle clouds, a hawk circling over distant hills, a creek that flashed silver between the rocks. Samuel sat with a book open in his lap, but wasn't reading it. Abigail could tell by the way his eyes didn't move across the page. Noah fell asleep against her arm within the first hour, and stayed there, one small fist curled against her sleeve. His breath slow and steady in a way that reminded her so painfully of his father that she had to turn her face toward the window for a while. Ethan sat across from her and watched the land pass, and didn't say anything at all. When the train pulled into Cheyenne Station in the late afternoon, Abigail stood and straightened her coat and took stock of her children, the way she always did, checking faces, checking boots, smoothing Jacob's hair down where it was determined to stand up, regardless of what anyone did to it. "All right," she said. "Let's go." "Is he going to be there?" Noah asked. His voice was very small. "He said he would be." "What does he look like?" "I don't know, baby." "What if we can't find him?" "We'll find him," she said. "Come on." She stepped off that train onto the Cheyenne platform with her spine straight and her chin up and her heart hammering so hard against her ribs she was mildly surprised no one around her could hear it. The platform was crowded. Men in work coats and trail dust. Women with hat boxes and children pulling at their skirts. A cattle buyer arguing loudly with a railroad clerk. A dog sleeping under a bench as though the whole chaos of the world had nothing to do with him. Abigail scanned the crowd. Then a man stepped forward from the edge of the platform, and she knew immediately it was him. She could not have explained why something in the way he stood, perhaps steady and unhurried in the middle of the commotion, or the way his eyes moved across the arriving passengers with a quiet deliberateness, searching without appearing to search. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives. A hat that had seen years of weather. A face that wasn't young anymore, but wasn't old either. Somewhere in that territory between 40 and the far side of hard experience, with lines at the corners of his eyes that might have come from squinting into the sun, or might have come from grief, or more likely both. His eyes found her. He walked toward her. "Mrs. Harper?" he said. His voice was low and even. He touched the brim of his hat. "Luke Mercer." "Mr. Mercer." She shook his hand. Her grip was firm. She'd decided that weeks ago, lying awake in Colorado Springs practicing the moment. She would not grip like a woman apologizing for taking up space. She would grip like a woman who had kept 4 children alive on nothing for 2 years and had earned the right to stand on level ground with anybody. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe. A recalibration. He looked past her at the boys. Noah, who had been hiding slightly behind Abigail's skirt, peered around at this tall man with enormous eyes. Jacob immediately said, "Are you the rancher Ma said you have horses? How many horses do you have? I've never been on a ranch. Can I ride one?" Luke Mercer blinked. Then one corner of his mouth moved just barely. "Reckon we can arrange that," he said. Samuel said nothing. He watched Luke with those careful, observant eyes of his cataloging information the way Samuel always did, filing it away somewhere Abigail couldn't see. Ethan stepped forward. He was nearly as tall as Luke already, with that 17-year-old intensity that came from having had to grow up faster than any boy should. "I'm Ethan Harper," he said. He didn't extend his hand. "Abigail's oldest." "I can see that," Luke said. He met the boy's eyes without flinching. "You look like a young man who knows how to work." "I do." "Good," Luke said simply. "I've got plenty of it." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, and not all the way toward anything resembling trust, but enough. Luke turned back to Abigail. "You travel all right." "We managed," she said. "Long day." "Long enough." He nodded. He picked up the heavy end of the trunk, the same end Ethan had been carrying, without asking or announcing he was going to do it, and started walking toward where his wagon waited. Abigail stood for a moment on that platform, the wind coming in off the plains and pulling at her coat, watching this stranger carry her belongings toward an unknown future, and she breathed, in, out. All right, she told herself. All right, here we go. The ride out to the Mercer Ranch took the better part of an hour on a road that started out reasonably maintained and grew progressively less so as they moved away from town. Luke drove. Abigail sat beside him on the wagon bench. The boys rode in the bed behind Jacob, continuing his commentary on every visible feature of the Wyoming landscape until Samuel told him quietly to give it a rest, at which point Jacob gave it a rest for approximately 4 minutes before starting again. Luke didn't appear to mind. At one point during a stretch when even Jacob had gone quiet, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind, Luke said, not looking at her, watching the road, "I want to say something before we get there." "All right," Abigail said. "I know what this situation looks like from the outside. A widow with 4 boys, a lonely rancher, a business arrangement. I know that's how some folks would read it." Abigail waited. "I don't read it that way," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that up front. I'm not looking for a housekeeper. I had a housekeeper for a while after Eleanor died. It didn't help much." He paused. "I don't fully know what I'm looking for, but when I read your letter—" He stopped again. "You were honest in that letter." "I tried to be," she said. "I appreciated it." He was quiet for a moment. "I wrote back to you honest too. Everything I said in that letter I meant." Abigail looked at the side of his face, the jaw, the set of his eyes on the road ahead. "Why haven't you remarried?" she asked. "In 5 years." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he said, "Because it takes something out of you, losing someone. It takes something specific out of you, and you don't get it back, and I spent a long time thinking that meant I didn't have enough left to offer anyone else." "What changed your mind?" Another silence. Longer. "I'm not sure anything did," he said finally. "I'm not sure I changed my mind so much as I got tired of the alternative." They rode in quiet after that. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind that comes when 2 people have said something real and are letting it settle. The ranch appeared as the sun was dropping toward the western mountains, a collection of buildings spread across a wide, flat reach of land, with fencing extending out in every direction, and cattle visible in the middle distance, dark shapes moving slowly through the autumn-colored grass. Abigail had told herself she would not feel anything when she first saw it. She had told herself not to make it mean more than it was. It was a house. It was a place to start from. It was nothing yet, but it was a house, with a proper roof and proper windows and a chimney from which she could envision smoke rising on cold mornings. And the land around it went on and on, gold and amber in the late light, wide open in a way that felt like breathing room rather than emptiness. Noah in the wagon bed said very quietly, "Oh." Just that. "Oh." Abigail pressed her lips together and looked at the road. The weeks that followed were not easy. She had not expected them to be easy. Easy was not a word she had applied to her life since before her husband Robert had gotten sick, and she had made her peace with that. The ranch house was large and cold, and had the specific kind of disorder that accumulates when a capable man lives alone too long. Not dirty exactly, but neglected in all the small ways that matter. Curtains that had never been hung. Pantry shelves holding 3 things where they should have held 30. A kitchen that had clearly been used for the minimum required to keep a person alive, and nothing beyond that. Abigail walked through it on the first evening while Luke showed the boys the barn, and she took a long, slow inventory. She was not discouraged. She was, if she was honest with herself, quietly energized. Because she could see exactly what this place needed, and what it needed was her, and that was a clarity she had not felt in a very long time. She started the next morning at dawn. She had the kitchen organized before Luke came in for breakfast. She had bread rising before the boys were fully awake. She set the table, actually set it, plates and cups and a cloth she'd brought in her bag, because she'd suspected there wouldn't be one, and when Luke sat down and looked at the table and then looked at her, she said simply, "You're going to need to show me where you keep everything today, so I know what we have and what we need." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "Also, the pantry needs restocking." "I know." "And the curtains in the front room." "I never got around to it," he said. Eleanor picked out the fabric before she passed. "I couldn't figure out how to hang them without—" He stopped. "I just never got around to it." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "I'll hang them myself," she said, "if that's all right." He looked at his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." The ranch hands, 3 of them weathered men, named Cade Rubin, and a younger one, everyone called simply Dutch, were not hostile exactly, but they were uncertain. 3 of them had worked for Luke Mercer for years, and they had developed the particular loyalty of men who have come to respect someone through hard work done side by side. And they were watching this new arrangement with the wariness of people waiting to see whether it would complicate what they already had. Cade, the oldest with a gray beard and the slowest, most deliberate way of speaking, Abigail had ever encountered, came to the kitchen door on the 3rd morning and stood there with his hat in his hands. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Morning. You want coffee?" He looked slightly taken aback, as though he'd been prepared for a different interaction. "Yes, ma'am." She poured him a cup. He took it with both hands and stood there in the doorway. "The boys settling in all right?" he asked after a moment that suggested he was working up to something. "They are," she said. "The oldest one, Ethan. He was out by the horses at first light this morning." Abigail glanced up from the stove. "Was he causing trouble?" "No, ma'am. He was mucking out the stalls." Cade paused. "Nobody asked him to." She felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. "That sounds like Ethan," she said. Cade was quiet for another long moment. "We've been running a little short-handed since Dutch hurt his shoulder," he said. "Having a young man like that around willing to work, that's going to help." "I'm glad," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He put the cup down on the doorstep and walked back toward the barn, and that was the whole conversation, but something in it felt like an acknowledgement, and Abigail took it. Ethan never told her about the stalls. She never asked. But she watched him over the following days and saw what was happening. He was testing something. Not Luke specifically, not yet, but the place itself, the work, the weight of it. Ethan had been carrying responsibility since he was 14 years old and had watched his father's health fail, and he had developed a specific need to prove himself that Abigail recognized because she had the same need and had passed it to him without meaning to. He needed to earn his place. He needed the work to be real and the consequences of the work to matter, and the people around him to see it and respect it. He was finding all of those things here. One afternoon near the end of the 2nd week, Luke came in from the north pasture and found Ethan in the middle of repairing a section of fence that had been on the list for months. The boy was working methodically, carefully, doing it right rather than doing it fast. Luke stood and watched for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You've done this before." "Some," Ethan said. He kept working. "Your father teach you?" A brief pause. "Before he got sick." Luke was quiet. Then he said, "You're doing it right. Better than Reuben would have." Ethan didn't respond to that, but his shoulders, which had been carrying about 10 degrees of permanent defensive tension since they'd arrived, eased down just slightly. "I'll show you the far south line tomorrow if you want," Luke said. "Needs work, and it's a bigger job. 2 people is better." Ethan considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. Samuel's integration was quieter and stranger, and in some ways more interesting to watch. Samuel had always been the son who moved through the world by observing it. First he learned by watching, by cataloging, by understanding systems before he engaged with them. He spent the first week simply watching everything. Where things were, how decisions got made, who reported to whom, why certain choices were made about the cattle or the schedule or the use of the land. By the 2nd week he had started asking questions, not to Abigail, to Luke. He would appear at Luke's elbow at odd moments in the barn at the fence line, once in the early evening, when Luke was going over his ledger books at the kitchen table, and ask something precise and practical. Why do you winter the cattle in the east pasture instead of the north? How do you decide when to sell and when to hold? Cade said the creek runs low in summer. Has that always been the case, or is it getting worse? Luke, to his credit, answered every question. Directly and seriously, without the condescension some adults used with children, without shortcuts or oversimplifications. He answered Samuel the way he would answer a colleague, as though the boy's interest was legitimate and the questions deserved real answers. Abigail noticed this. She noticed it and filed it away and said nothing about it. Jacob's presence on the ranch was simpler and louder, and in its own way essential, because Jacob, at 10 years old, had an unlimited supply of something that the ranch had quietly been running out of, which was joy. Pure, uncomplicated, enthusiastic joy in small things. He was delighted by the horses. He was delighted by the chickens. He discovered that one of the barn cats had recently produced a litter of kittens and spent an entire afternoon conducting what he described as a formal census of how many there were and what color each one was and which one appeared to be in charge. He reported his findings to Luke at dinner with the gravity of a man delivering an important dispatch. "The gray one with the white foot is definitely in charge," Jacob announced. "She pushes the others out of the way for food, but then she comes back and cleans them, so she's tough but fair. I think she'd make a good sheriff." Luke sat with a slight expression on his face that Abigail couldn't immediately read. Then he said, "She's been running that barn for 3 years. I'd have to agree with your assessment." Jacob pointed at him. "I'm going to name her sheriff." "She already has a name," Luke said. "What is it?" "I call her Cat." Jacob stared. "That's not a name. That's a category." He shook his head with the profound disappointment of a child confronting adult inadequacy. "Her name is Sheriff now." Reuben, who was eating dinner with them that evening because he often did, laughed so suddenly he nearly choked on his biscuit. And then there was Noah. Noah was 6 years old and had lost his father at an age when the loss was felt more than understood, and he carried it in a particular way, not in the hard protective shell Ethan had built, or the quiet watchfulness Samuel had developed, or the relentless forward movement Jacob used to outrun the sadness. Noah carried it as a kind of gravity, a heaviness in his small chest, an openness always for something to fill the space. He attached himself to Luke Mercer within 48 hours of arriving at the ranch. It was not something anyone planned or engineered. It simply happened. Noah followed Luke. Not in a demanding way, not in the needy way of a child asking for things just present. Nearby, appearing at Luke's side with the patient reliability of a creature who has decided where home is and simply stays there. Luke didn't push him away. He didn't make a production of the boy's presence either. He just accommodated it naturally without comment, the way you accommodate something that has quietly become normal. He started lifting Noah onto the fence rail when he was doing work nearby so the boy could watch. He started asking Noah's opinion on small things, which horse seemed like it was in the best mood today, whether the clouds looked like rain, with a seriousness that Noah received like water on dry ground. One evening, Abigail came out of the house to call Noah in for supper, and found the two of them sitting on the top rail of the corral fence side by side, watching the horses in the fading light. Luke had one hand braced on the rail, his attention somewhere in the middle distance. Noah sat with his small legs dangling his shoulder just touching Luke's arm. Neither of them was talking. Abigail stood in the doorway and looked at her youngest son, sitting beside this tall, quiet man, in the last of the afternoon light, and she felt something move through her that was not entirely comfortable, a kind of fierce, complicated tenderness that had edges on it, because it knew how easily things could still go wrong. She called them in for supper. She did not cry. She was extremely proud of herself for not crying. She came closest to crying. She came very close on the evening near the end of the 3rd week, when Noah appeared at Luke's chair after supper, and climbed up onto his lap, with the casual confidence of a child who has done this many times before, settled himself against Luke's chest, and fell asleep within minutes. Luke sat very still. He held his book in one hand, and the other arm came around Noah slowly, carefully, as though he was not entirely sure he had the right to do it, and was doing it anyway. Abigail was washing dishes. She was looking at the wall in front of her. She heard, rather than saw, the stillness that settled over the kitchen. From across the room, without turning around, she said quietly, "He doesn't do that with everyone." "I know," Luke said. His voice was very low, and there was something in it that she had not heard there before. After a moment she said, "His father used to read to him in the evenings." "Yeah," Luke said. After another long silence he said, "I know a few stories if he wakes up wanting one." Abigail pressed her lips together and looked very hard at the wall in front of her and kept washing dishes. There were still difficult things. There were things that hadn't been said and wouldn't be easy to say, and a future that was still more question than answer. The arrangement between them was still formal in important ways. She was careful about that, and he was too careful to respect distances that needed to be respected, to not mistake gratitude for something it wasn't, or proximity for something it hadn't become yet. But there were evenings when he stayed at the table after dinner and didn't go back to the barn right away. Evenings when they sat with coffee going cold and talked about the ranch, about her boys, about the territory and the challenges of the winter coming, about things that mattered, and sometimes things that didn't. And the talking had an ease to it that Abigail recognized as rare. She had talked easily with Robert. She had not expected to find it again. One evening, he asked about Robert. Not in a probing way, gently, as though offering her the space rather than demanding entry. What was he like? She thought about it carefully. "Steady," she said finally. "Robert was the steadiest person I have ever known. Nothing rattled him. Not good news, not bad news, not hard times. He was just steady, like a good post in the ground." She smiled a little at the memory. "He used to drive me completely insane with it when things were hard, and he just sat there being steady." Luke made a sound that was almost a laugh. "But when he died," she said, and then stopped. "I understood then, because without him being steady, nothing else was steady. And I had to figure out how to be both things at once, the steady one and everything else." "You did," he said. "I did what I had to do." "That's more than most people manage," he said. Not flattery, observation. She looked at her coffee cup. "What was Eleanor like?" He was quiet for a long time. "Brave," he said at last. "She was the bravest person I knew. Not loud about it, she didn't make noise about things. She just kept walking forward, through hard things." He stopped. "The last year of her life when she was sick and we both knew it. She never stopped walking forward. She made plans. She planted a garden she knew she'd never see finished." His voice had gone quiet. "She told me a few weeks before the end. She told me she needed me to keep going. After. She made me promise to keep going." The fire crackled. "Have you?" Abigail asked softly. He considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I've been trying to figure out what that means," he said finally. "For a long time I thought it meant keeping the ranch alive, keeping things running, making sure what she and I built together didn't fall apart. And now?" He looked at the fire. "Now I think maybe she meant something bigger than that," he said. "I think she always did mean something bigger than that." The fire shifted. An ember dropped. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the land, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted its weight, and the chain of its stall clinked once in the darkness. Abigail didn't push it further. She let it lie where he'd put it. Some things needed to settle before you could see what they were. The town of Cheyenne had opinions about the arrangement. Cheyenne always had opinions. Abigail became aware of this on her third trip to the general store, when she caught two women stopping their conversation as she approached and resuming it in a slightly different register. The particular register that meant they had been talking about her and were now talking around her. She bought her flour and her salt and her bolts of fabric with perfect pleasantness, and said good morning to both women, and received murmured good mornings in return, and went about her business. In the wagon on the way back to the ranch, Jacob, who had come along because Jacob always came along when given the option, said, "Those ladies were talking about you." "People talk," Abigail said, "about you and Mr. Mercer." "I know." "Clem Hargrove's wife said you trapped him." Jacob's brow was furrowed with the specific offense of a child who has overheard something unfair about someone he loves. Abigail kept her eyes on the road. "What did you say?" Jacob considered. "I told her Mr. Mercer didn't look like a man who got trapped easy." He paused. "She looked like she'd swallowed something bad." Abigail bit the inside of her cheek very firmly. "Jacob," she said. "Ma'am." "Next time you say nothing." "Yes, ma'am." He was quiet for a full 30 seconds. "But I was right, though." "Yes," she said. "You were right. You were." That evening she mentioned it to Luke. Not with distress, she had decided she would not be distressed about the town's opinion, but with honesty, because she had decided they would do this honestly or not at all. "People are talking," she said. "I want you to know I'm aware of it." He looked at her steadily. "I've been aware of it since before you arrived. And I don't much care," he said. "I stopped letting Cheyenne make decisions for me a long time ago. You should too." "It's easier for you," she said. "This is your town, your land, your reputation." "My reputation is fine," he said. "And yours will be fine too." He paused. "You're going to earn the respect of this town the same way you earn everything else, by showing them who you are and letting the work speak. It'll take time, but it'll happen." She looked at him. "You sound very sure." "I've watched you work for 3 weeks," he said. "I'm sure." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, and that was the end of that conversation. But she thought about it afterward. She thought about the simplicity of his certainty. Not false comfort, not empty reassurance, but the considered conviction of a man who had watched her and formed a conclusion based on evidence. It was the thing about Luke Mercer that she found most consistently surprising. He saw her. Not the things other people saw. Not the weight. Not the widow's circumstances. Not the 4-son burden that made her unmarriageable to 12 out of 14. He saw the actual person underneath all of that and responded to what he found there. She was not accustomed to being seen that way. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. What she did was what she always did. She worked. She worked the kitchen until it ran the way a kitchen should run. She worked the household accounts and found 3 places where Luke's inattention had allowed small expenditures to accumulate into larger drains, and she corrected them. She learned the names of every hand on the ranch, learned what each man was good at, and where each man needed direction, and she began directing without overstepping. Supporting where support was needed, stepping back where it wasn't. She hung Eleanor's curtains in the front room. She did it on a Tuesday afternoon when Luke was out at the far pasture and the boys were at their lessons. She had established lessons daily because education did not stop because the address had changed. She got the step stool and the curtain rod and the fabric that had waited 5 years in a cedar chest, and she hung those curtains in every window of the front room. And when she was finished, she stood back and looked at them, and thought about the woman who had chosen this fabric with hands that wouldn't live to see it hung. "I'll take care of it," she thought, "in the general direction of whoever might be listening. Whatever you left here, I'll take care of it." When Luke came in that evening and saw the curtains, he stopped in the doorway of the front room. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "They look right." "She had good taste," Abigail said from the kitchen. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Yes," he said. "She did." The words cost him something. She heard it. She received it without making him explain it. "Supper's in 20 minutes," she said. He went to wash up, and the subject was closed, and the curtains hung in the front room windows and caught the evening light in the way Eleanor had imagined they would, and the ranch was a slightly different place because of it. Outside, across the wide reaches of Wyoming land, the autumn was deepening toward winter. The light was gold and cold in the mornings. The nights came earlier and harder. The cattle were moved to where they needed to be for the cold months, and fences were checked and reinforced, and firewood was cut and stacked in quantities that Luke said were enough, and Abigail looked at and added to anyway, because she had grown up in cold places, and she knew what enough looked like, and she knew this wasn't it yet. One evening, as the first genuine bite of approaching winter moved in off the mountains, Luke came and stood at the kitchen window beside her while she was kneading bread, and he looked out at the sky that was going dark too fast, and he said, "It's going to be a hard winter." "I know," she said. "Harder than last year." "I figured." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're here, Abigail." She kept kneading. Her hands didn't stop. "I'm glad to be here," she said. Neither of them looked at the other. They both looked at the darkening sky outside the window, and the wind moved across the land, and the lamp on the table threw its light in a warm circle around the kitchen, and all four boys were somewhere in the house, making the sounds of four boys being alive in a house. And something that had been still for a long time on the Mercer Ranch was beginning very quietly, very carefully to move again. The cold came to Mercer Ranch the way it always did in Wyoming, not as a warning, but as a verdict. One morning, Abigail woke before dawn and knew before she put her feet on the floor that something had shifted in the night. The air inside the house had a different weight to it. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen and built the fire up high and stood at the window while the coffee boiled and watched the pale gray light spread across a landscape that had gone hard and still sometime between midnight and morning. Winter had made its decision. She had 4 extra cords of firewood in the lean-to that Luke had said was unnecessary, and she had stacked anyway, and she was not going to say a word about it. She was simply going to be grateful that she knew cold places, and she knew what enough looked like, and she had not let anyone talk her out of the preparation. Luke came in from checking the animals earlier than usual, his coat carrying frost on the shoulders, his breath visible even inside the doorway. He poured himself coffee and stood by the stove and said, "You were right about the wood." "I didn't say anything," she said. "You didn't need to," he said. She handed him a plate of biscuits and said nothing further, and that was, she had come to understand over the past months the particular grammar of their communication things, stated plainly. Things left understood, very little wasted on ceremony. It suited her. It suited him. They had arrived at it without negotiation, the way people arrive at things when they're honest enough to let the actual arrangement emerge, rather than imposing one from the outside. The boys had adjusted to winter with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Jacob found it exhilarating in the comprehensive way Jacob found most things exhilarating, appearing every morning with fresh ideas about what snow was useful for, and conducting ongoing experiments in its properties that occasionally involved the barn roof, and twice involved Reuben, who took it better than anyone might have expected. Samuel had quietly acquired 3 books about the Wyoming Territory and its climate from the lending library in Cheyenne, and was reading them systematically, connecting what he read to what he observed, building the internal picture of a place that Samuel always needed before he was ready to commit to it fully. Ethan worked. That was the constant. Whatever else shifted or softened or evolved in the boy, the work remained the center. He was out before anyone else, and back after most, and in between, he carried himself with the seriousness of a man twice his age, who has taken on a weight he will not put down, because he has decided this weight is his to carry. Luke noticed. Luke noticed everything about Ethan quietly, from an appropriate distance. The way you observe something that needs to come to you on its own terms, rather than being rushed. One afternoon near the end of November, Luke asked Ethan to come with him to look at the north fence line. Just the 2 of them. They were out for most of the afternoon, and when they came back, Ethan was not transformed. Ethan did not transform. He evolved slowly and on his own schedule, but something in the set of his face was fractionally less defended than it had been that morning. Luke said nothing about what they'd discussed. Ethan said nothing either. But at supper that evening, Ethan asked Luke directly and without preamble what he thought about buying additional cattle in the spring versus waiting until summer prices shifted. Luke answered him with the same seriousness he brought to Samuel's questions, as though the opinion of a 16-year-old who had been paying attention for 2 months was worth answering fully. Cade, sitting across the table, caught Abigail's eye for half a second. She looked away first. The winter deepened, and the ranch contracted around its warmth, and the days developed their own rhythm. The rhythm of cold places, where the work is harder and the hours shorter, and the spaces between activities take on an importance they don't have in easier seasons. After supper, the table lingered. The lamp stayed lit later. People talked because talking was what you did when there was nowhere else to go. It was during one of these evenings in the first week of December that Charles Whitmore's man first came to the ranch. Abigail was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats, and she went to the window and saw a rider coming in from the road at a pace that was slightly too deliberate to be casual. Luke was on the porch. She watched him go down the steps to meet the man, and she couldn't hear the conversation from inside, but she could read Luke's posture, and what she read there was not welcome. The man was there for 10 minutes. Then he left, and Luke came inside, and his face was the face of a man who has just received news he was half expecting and entirely did not want. "Who was that?" she asked. "Name's Garrett. He works for Charles Whitmore." Luke set his hat on the hook and stood for a moment. "Whitmore wants to buy the East water rights." "Just the water rights?" "For now," Luke said. The "for now" carried everything it needed to. Abigail had heard the name Whitmore in the 3 months since her arrival in town from the ranch hands, once from the postmaster, who said it with the particular careful neutrality of a man who knows who has money and what money does in a small territory. Charles Whitmore owned the neighboring property to the east, a large operation profitable run with a kind of cold efficiency that people in Cheyenne discussed in terms that mixed admiration with something less comfortable. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him no." She nodded. "And—" Luke looked at her steadily. "And Garrett told me Mr. Whitmore would like me to reconsider." He paused. In the tone of a man who's been sent to say that in exactly that tone for exactly the reason that tone works. "Does it?" she asked. "Work? Not on me," Luke said. She believed him. But she also looked at the way he stood, the slight forward lean of a man bracing for something that isn't coming yet, but he knows is coming, and she thought, this isn't done. Whatever Charles Whitmore wanted, he was not the kind of man who asked twice and then accepted the answer. She was right. Over the following 2 weeks, small things began to happen. A section of the east fence line was found cut cleanly, deliberately, not broken by weather or animals. 3 cattle drifted through the gap before Cade found it and rode back to report his voice carrying a flatness that was its own kind of alarm. Luke walked the repaired fence line that evening and came back saying nothing, but his jaw was set in a way Abigail recognized by now. Then Dutch found 2 water troughs in the north pasture contaminated, something dumped in them. He said something that smelled chemical and wrong, nothing a cow should be drinking. They lost 1 animal before they realized what had happened. Luke stood at that fence line afterward for a long time without speaking, and when he turned around and walked back to the barn, his face was controlled in the manner of a man who is controlling it with effort. Ethan, who had been with Dutch when the troughs were found, came to the kitchen that evening, tight with anger he was barely managing. "He's doing it," Ethan said. "We don't know that," Abigail said. "Ma!" Just her name delivered with 17 years of frustration at adults who required more evidence than was reasonable. "I know," she said, "but we need to be careful about what we say out loud, and to whom." Ethan stood with his arms crossed, the posture of a young man learning that the world does not respond quickly enough to clearly visible injustice. And this was a lesson Abigail hated watching him learn, because she had learned it herself, and it had never stopped being painful. "Luke's handling it," she said. "How?" "By being smarter than Whitmore expects him to be," she said. "That's how you handle men like that, not with noise, with intelligence." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. Not because he was satisfied, but because he trusted her, and she had told him something with enough conviction that he was willing to wait and see. What Luke was actually doing, Abigail learned in pieces over the following week, was building a record. Every instance of damage, every suspicious event, dates, specifics, witnesses. Cade was keeping track. Dutch was keeping track. Luke had written to an attorney in Laramie with whom he had done business before. He didn't tell her all of this at once. He told her portions of it at the ends of evenings, sitting at the kitchen table, after the boys were in bed, in the manner of a man who was used to handling things alone, but was slowly, and perhaps without fully realizing it, in the process of no longer handling things alone. She asked questions. He answered them. They thought through the situation together, and Abigail found, and this surprised her less than it once would have, that she had useful things to contribute. She had managed a household and its accounts through poverty and crisis. She understood pressure, and she understood the ways men like Whitmore applied it, because men like Whitmore were a feature of every town she had ever lived in, and the mechanism was always the same. "He's going to escalate," she said one evening. "I know," Luke said. "Before he escalates, he's going to come back and offer more money. He'll want to give you a chance to take the easy way out. Men like him need that step. It's not generosity, it's documentation. He wants to be able to say he made a fair offer." Luke looked at her. "You know men like him well. I know what happened to families who had things men like him wanted," she said simply. "I watched it happen when I was growing up. Same pattern every time." She paused. The difference between the families who survived it and the ones who didn't was almost never about strength. It was about whether they saw the pattern clearly enough and prepared for the right step, not the last step. "What's the right step here?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. "You need more witnesses than Whitmore has, and you need the ones you have to be people the territory trusts." She paused. "Cade has been out here 30 years. People know him. If Cade documents what he saw and puts his name to it, that's different from just your account." Luke was quiet for a moment. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I should have been a lot of things," she said. "I ended up being the mother of 4 boys instead, which teaches you considerably more about adversarial negotiation than any law school probably does." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She had gotten better at drawing those out. And then he was quiet again, thinking, and she let him think because she had learned that Luke Mercer's silences were productive ones, not avoidances, and what came out of them was usually worth waiting for. What came out of this one eventually was, "I want you to know something, Abigail." She waited. "Whatever Whitmore does, whatever he throws at this ranch, it doesn't change anything about why I asked you to come here." He looked at her directly. "I need you to know that's not connected. This situation with Whitmore is a problem I had before you arrived, and I'll manage it the same way I'd manage it if you weren't here. But I didn't bring you and your boys into this to be part of a problem. I want that to be clear." She looked at him for a long moment. "Luke," she said. "Ma'am, I was part of Robert's problems," she said. "That's what being a partner means. I've been part of a problem before, and I'm still standing." She held his gaze. "Don't protect me from the ranch. I came here to be part of the ranch." Something moved across his face. Not quite the almost laugh. Something quieter. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Charles Whitmore came in person the 2nd week of December. He arrived in a carriage, a good one, the kind that announced money without appearing to announce money, which was its own announcement. He was a man of about 50, well-dressed, in the particular way of men who have had money long enough that elegance has become unconscious. He was not physically intimidating. He had the smooth manner of someone who has discovered that intimidation is more efficient when it's invisible. Luke met him on the porch. Abigail did not go out. She stayed in the kitchen and kept her hands busy with something that needed doing and listened through the window that she had perhaps not entirely by accident left slightly open. Whitmore opened pleasantly. Comments on the ranch, on the season, on the territory. The warm-up of a man skilled at these conversations. Then he moved to his purpose, and his purpose was money. He named a figure for the East water rights that Abigail suspected was genuinely generous, because a man like Whitmore would not insult Luke's intelligence with a low offer on his real visit. He wanted Luke to say yes to a fair number, which would then become the foundation for the next ask. Luke said no. Simply, without elaboration, no. Whitmore's response was interesting. He didn't push. He changed subjects with the smoothness of a man who has learned that resistance can be worked around rather than overcome. He talked about the winter, about the territory's growth, about the opportunities for men who position themselves correctly in the coming years. He mentioned in passing that he'd heard Luke had taken on some new help. A widow from Colorado, wasn't it? Several children. Luke's voice did not change. That's correct, he said. That's a significant undertaking, Whitmore said. The tone was pleasant. Only the implications beneath the pleasantness were not. Not particularly, Luke said. 4 children, I understand, and the woman a substantial woman, I'm told. The silence that followed lasted just long enough. Mr. Whitmore, Luke said, and his voice had changed now, still even, but with something beneath the evenness that made it an entirely different thing. You rode out here to talk business. I'm going to ask you to keep the conversation to the business. A pause. Of course, Whitmore said, smooth, unruffled. No offense intended. None registered, Luke said with the particular meaning that phrase carries when what it actually means is the opposite. The conversation ended shortly after. Whitmore left. Luke came inside and Abigail was standing at the stove, and she didn't turn around, and he didn't say anything about what had been said outside, and neither did she. He poured himself coffee and stood for a moment and then said, I'm going to ride the east fence line. I'll have supper ready at 6, she said. He left. She stood at the stove and breathed carefully because she was angry, and she had learned that anger was most useful when it was directed rather than scattered, and she needed a moment to direct it. Substantial, he had said. Like it was a liability, like it was a thing that reduced her, reduced Luke for choosing her, reduced the whole arrangement to something that could be managed through the right kind of social pressure. She had been called worse. She had absorbed worse. She knew exactly what men like Whitmore used and why they used it, not because they believed it necessarily, but because it was a tool, and tools that work get used. What mattered was that Luke had shut it down. Without drama. Without explanation. Without offering Whitmore the satisfaction of a reaction that could be studied and used. That evening, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, she told Luke what she'd heard. He wasn't surprised that she'd listened. He didn't comment on it. He just nodded. He's not going to stop, she said. No, he agreed. What do you need from me? He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the wind had come up, moving across the eaves with that particular winter sound that was half moan and half whisper. Keep doing what you're doing, he said. Keep the house running. Keep the boys steady. When I need you for something specific, I'll tell you. You'll tell me, she said, not a question. I'll tell you, he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. She nodded. Then I'll tell you something. He waited. Samuel's been going through your ledger books. A blink. With your permission. With mine, yes. Not yet with yours, which is why I'm telling you. She paused. He found something. In the accounts from 2 years ago. He thinks there's a pattern in the cattle sales figures that doesn't match what the records should show. She held his eyes. He's 13 years old, and he's been paying attention to this ranch for 3 months, and he thinks something in those numbers is wrong. Luke was very still. What exactly does he think he found? He asked carefully. He wants to show you himself, she said. He's been nervous about asking. He didn't want to overstep. He won't overstep, Luke said. He stood up from the table. Where is he? Luke, it's past 9. I know what time it is. He paused at the kitchen doorway. If that boy has found something real in those numbers, it can't wait until morning while I sit down here knowing it's up there. Abigail looked at him for a moment. Then she said, second door on the right. He went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to the footsteps overhead, and then the low sound of voices, Luke's and Samuel's, and the voices continued for a while longer than she expected, and when Luke came back downstairs 20 minutes later, his face had changed. He sat down at the table. He found it, he said. Found what? A discrepancy, Luke said. In the cattle sales from 2 years ago, someone was recording fewer heads sold than were actually moved. He stopped. It's not a lot of money, but it's consistent. Too consistent to be an error. Abigail held very still. Do you know who had access to those records 2 years ago? I had a manager then, Luke said. Man named Greer. He left the territory about 18 months ago. I assumed. He stopped. I assumed he left because he had reasons of his own. I didn't look hard at the reasons. Could he have been working with Whitmore? The silence was its own answer. Samuel figured this out, Luke said. It was not entirely a statement. It had something else in it, something close to wonder. Samuel figures things out, Abigail said. It's what he does. He watches until he understands the system, and then he finds where the system is broken. She paused. He needs someone to take him seriously when he does. Luke looked at her. I'm going to take him very seriously, he said. Starting tomorrow morning, he's working with me directly on the accounts. He paused again. If there's documentation of what Greer did, if we can connect it to Whitmore, it changes everything, Abigail said. Yes, he said. It changes everything. She looked at him across the table. This man who had driven alone through 5 years of grief and silence, and a ranch that survived but didn't live, who had answered one honest letter, and changed the course of 5 people's lives with 3 paragraphs of his own honesty. And she thought about Samuel upstairs lying awake now, almost certainly turning over numbers in that organized, careful mind of his, not knowing yet that what he'd found might be the thing that saved this place. Her son. Her careful, quiet, watching son. Luke, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for taking him seriously. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, Don't thank me for that. That one's easy. It shouldn't be, she said, but it often is. He didn't have an answer to that. He looked at the table. He looked back at her. And then carefully, slowly, like a man making a decision he has been approaching for some time without naming it, he said, Abigail, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly. She waited. I know the arrangement when you came here was what it was, he said. Practical. Clear. I know we've both been careful about keeping it what it is. He paused. I'm starting to find that difficult. The fire shifted. The lamp sent a small shimmer across the table between them. Finding what difficult, she asked because she needed to hear him say it plainly. Keeping it practical, he said. He looked at her steadily. You've been here 4 months, and you've made this place something it wasn't, and you've made these boys something better than they were coming in, and you've... He stopped. You've made me remember what it felt like to look forward to coming inside. The silence was long and full of things. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I'm not pressing you. I know this is still new, and the situation with Whitmore makes everything more complicated, and I don't want you to feel like... Luke, she said. He stopped. I hang Eleanor's curtains every morning, she said. I make coffee before you're awake because I know you'll be in before first light. I keep the lamp on until you're back from the late checks. She paused. I've been here 4 months, and I can tell you every habit you have that you don't know you have. She held his eyes. That's not practical anymore. That stopped being just practical a while ago. He looked at her. I'm scared, she said, because they were being honest. I was scared the last time too, and the last time worked until it didn't, and now I know exactly how badly it can hurt when you've built something and then you lose it. So am I, he said, quietly, without apology. I know, she said. I can see it. She paused. But I'm still here. He nodded. Once. Something in him settled. Not resolved, not finished, but settled in the way that things settle when they've been named and don't have to be carried unnamed anymore. Still here, he said. Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming night, and in the barn, the horses shifted their weight in the cold. And somewhere upstairs, a boy who had just helped save a ranch was lying awake, doing arithmetic in the dark, because that was the kind of boy he was. And the lamp on the kitchen table burned between 2 people who were not entirely sure yet what they were building, but had each decided separately, and then together, that it was worth the building. The days that followed moved at the particular speed of wading fast on the surface slow underneath, with the specific drag that comes when you know something is coming, and you don't know exactly what shape it will arrive in. Samuel met with Luke every morning after breakfast to go through the accounts. No one made a ceremony of it. It simply became the pattern the way things on the Mercer Ranch tended to become patterns once they'd proven themselves useful. Samuel would clear the table of breakfast plates and spread the ledger books in their place, and Luke would sit across from him and they would work through the numbers with a methodical patience that was Abigail thought characteristic of both of them in different ways. Ethan watched this arrangement with an expression that took Abigail several days to correctly identify. It was not jealousy. Ethan was not a jealous boy. It was something more like recognition, as though he was seeing his brother be taken seriously by a man they both needed to be taken seriously by, and the seeing of it was doing something to his own defenses. He didn't say this. Ethan rarely said the important things directly, but one morning at the end of the week, he appeared at Luke's side while Luke was saddling horses and said without preamble, "I've been thinking about the east fence." Luke looked at him. "What about it?" "The section that was cut," Ethan said. "Whoever did it knew where to cut. They knew which section would let the most cattle through before anyone found it." He paused. "They knew this land." Luke was still. "Someone who knew this ranch," Ethan said. "Or someone who was told about it by someone who did." The silence between them had weight in it. Luke finished with the horse he was saddling and turned to face Ethan fully. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's an observation," Ethan said. "An accusation would be naming someone." Luke looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I've been thinking the same thing." He paused. "You able to keep that between us for now?" Ethan met his eyes. "Yes, sir," he said. It was the first time he had said sir. Neither of them remarked on it. But Abigail, watching from the doorway where she had come to call them in for coffee, felt the significance of it move through her like a current. Her son, her guarded, careful, armor-plated son, who had been 15 when his father died, and had decided somewhere in the grief of that loss that trust was a luxury he could not afford. Her son had just said sir to Luke Mercer, not because he was required to, not because the situation demanded it, because he had decided on his own schedule and his own terms that the man had earned it. She went back inside. She kept the coffee hot. The information Samuel had found, the discrepancy in the cattle records, the too consistent pattern that pointed to deliberate manipulation rather than error, was sent to the attorney in Laramie by the end of the week. Luke had gone through the records himself with Samuel beside him and confirmed what the boy had found. He had also found 2 additional irregularities he had missed the first time. A pattern was becoming visible. Not complete yet, not provable in full yet, but visible. Cade, when told, sat quietly for a while. Then he said, "Greer always did spend more in town than a man on his salary ought to." Luke looked at him. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Cade said. "Men have their reasons for what they spend. Wasn't my business." He paused. "I'm thinking now it might have been connected. To Whitmore. To someone with money to give away." He paused. "Whitmore has money to give away." It was not proof. It was the shape of proof, the outline of something that could become proof with enough time and the right documentation. Luke forwarded Cade's statement to the attorney with the rest. Dutch, when he heard, simply said, "That sorry son of a," and then stopped himself and looked at Abigail and said, "Pardon, ma'am." "Don't pardon yourself on my account," she said. "I was thinking something similar." Dutch's expression arranged itself into something that was almost a grin. He was the youngest of the 3 ranch hands and had the most unguarded face of the 3, and he had been, Abigail thought, the one who had moved from uncertain to won over most quickly, not because she had done anything specific to win him, but because Dutch was young enough to not have fully calcified around the idea that new things were suspicious, and what she'd given him was enough biscuits and direct conversation that the suspicion hadn't had a chance to harden. He had also, she was aware, become something of a protective presence around the boys. Not overt, not announced, just present in the right ways at the right times, appearing near the barn when Ethan was working alone in the early dark, showing Jacob the proper way to hold a rope so he didn't hurt his hands on it, taking Samuel along once to check the cattle in the north pasture and answering every question the boy asked, with a patience that suggested Dutch had either an older brother or a great deal of natural tolerance. Jacob called him Dutch, with the easy familiarity of a 10-year-old who has decided a person is a friend and sees no reason not to announce it. Dutch called Jacob Kid, with the tone of a young man who is pretending not to be delighted by this. On the Saturday afternoon in the third week of December, Abigail received a letter. She did not recognize the return address immediately. Then she did. It was from the school board in Laramie. She had applied for a teaching position there in the summer before she had written to Luke before she had come here. She had applied for 6 positions in 3 territories and had heard back from none of them, and she had put them out of her mind. She stood at the kitchen table and read the letter twice. They were offering her a permanent position, starting in the new year, a school in Laramie, full salary, housing included. Everything she had wanted when she wrote those applications. Everything a widowed mother with 4 sons and no security should want: guaranteed income, guaranteed shelter, a future with a floor under it. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter. She went back to the bread she was making and worked the dough with her hands for a long time. And she did not think about the letter while she worked, or she tried not to, and mostly she did not succeed. Noah came in from outside and asked for biscuits from yesterday, and she gave him 2, and he sat at the table and ate them and said, "Are you okay, Ma?" She looked at her youngest son, 6 years old, with his father's eyes and the particular kind of perception that comes to children who have been made attentive by loss, the ones who learned early to read the air of a room for signs of danger or change, and who never quite lost the habit even after the immediate danger passed. "I'm fine, baby," she said. He looked at her for another second with those old soul eyes of his. Then he said, "Mr. Luke's coming in for supper later. I can hear the horses." "I know," she said. "Go wash your hands." He went to wash his hands. She stood at the kitchen counter and thought about the letter in the drawer. Then she started making supper because supper was what was needed right now, and the letter would still be in the drawer after supper was done. And she had learned a long time ago that the decisions that mattered did not become clearer by being rushed. Luke came in at 6. The boys came in from various corners of the ranch and the house at the same irregular intervals they always did. Ethan last always, because Ethan always gave himself one more thing to check before he came in. And this was so consistent that Noah had started predicting it, counting the seconds between when everyone else arrived and when Ethan's boots sounded on the porch steps. 43, Noah announced at supper. 43 what? Ethan said, settling into his chair. Seconds from when everyone else sat down to when you came in. Noah said this with scientific satisfaction. I've been tracking it for 2 weeks. Your average is 41. Jacob said. What's the record? 67, Noah said. The day the fence broke. Ethan stared at his youngest brother. Then he said, You've been timing me. For data, Noah said seriously. Luke made the sound that was almost a laugh. It had become more of a laugh over the past months, less, almost more actual, coming more easily than it used to. The way things do when the muscles that produce them have been getting more regular use. Abigail looked at her 4 sons, and this man at the head of the table, and the sound of 5 people existing together in a kitchen on a cold December evening, and she thought about the letter in the drawer. And she thought, I know what I want to do. The harder question was what she was allowed to want. She had come here in a practical arrangement for practical reasons. She had told herself that was all this was, and she had kept telling herself that through 4 months of curtains and coffee and conversations at the late end of evenings. She had told herself she was not owed the hope that had been building quietly in her chest since the day they arrived, because hope was a thing you earned with time and certainty, not something you constructed out of 4 months of good meals and kind words, and a man who had cut Charles Whitmore off cold when Whitmore had called her substantial. But then she looked at Noah sitting beside Luke with absolute unconscious trust, tracking Ethan's arrival times for data. She looked at Samuel, who had found something in the ledger books that might save this ranch, and had been taken seriously for finding it. She looked at Jacob, who was currently explaining to Cade, who had joined them for supper, the ranking system he had developed for all 18 of the barn cats, of which Sheriff was currently ranked first. She looked at Ethan, who had said sir without anyone asking him to. She thought about the letter in the drawer. She thought about what she was going to do about it. She passed the bread. She did not make any decisions over supper. But by the time the dishes were done, and the boys were in bed, and the kitchen was quiet, and Luke was sitting at the table with his coffee going cool, and the ledger books open in front of him, she stood in the kitchen doorway and knew with the quiet certainty of a woman who has learned to trust her own intelligence about the things that matter what the letter in the drawer was going to mean. She didn't take it out of the drawer that night. That night she let the knowledge sit. Tomorrow she would know what to do with it. Tonight she put fresh coffee on and went to sit across from Luke at the kitchen table and said, "Show me what Samuel found." And Luke turned the ledger book toward her, and they bent over the numbers together in the lamplight, while outside the Wyoming winter settled its weight across the land, patient and absolute, the way only cold and time can be. The letter stayed in the drawer for 3 days. Abigail did not avoid it. She opened that drawer every morning for coffee and every evening for the dish towels, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has weight without being heavy, present in the peripheral vision of her thinking even when she was looking at something else entirely. On the 4th day, Samuel found it. Not by snooping. Samuel never snooped. It wasn't how he operated. He had been reaching for the spare ink he knew she kept in the back of that drawer for the ledger, work he and Luke had been doing each morning, and when he pulled the drawer open, the letter was sitting there folded with the Laramie School Board's return address visible on the outside. He didn't read it. He pushed the drawer closed and went back to the table and sat down and didn't say anything. But he looked at her with those careful eyes of his, the ones that cataloged and filed and understood systems, and she understood from the look that he had seen enough to know what it was. That evening after supper, he came to stand beside her at the kitchen counter. He didn't say anything for a moment. She kept washing dishes. "Ma," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Are you going to tell him?" She thought about how to answer that. "I'm going to handle it," she said. Samuel was quiet for another moment. Then, with the particular precision of a 13-year-old who has been paying attention to adult behavior long enough to have formed useful opinions about it, he said, "He should know." "I know he should," she said. "The longer you wait, Samuel." She said it gently but firmly. "I know." He nodded. He picked up a dish towel and started drying without being asked, which was so characteristic of him that it made her chest hurt a little. Then he said very quietly, "I don't want to leave." She stopped washing. She set the dish she was holding down in the water and stood for a moment with her hands still submerged and her eyes on the wall in front of her. "I know, baby," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of it. "Jacob doesn't know about the letter," he said. "I know? He'd be upset. I know that too. Noah would—" He stopped. He didn't finish that sentence because there wasn't a good way to finish it, and he was smart enough to know that. Abigail dried her hands. She turned and looked at her second son, this quiet, careful, methodical boy who had found a discrepancy in a rancher's ledger books and might have just saved everything, who had walked into this arrangement, suspicious and watchful, and had spent 4 months building a picture from the inside out until he understood it well enough to trust it, and who was standing in this kitchen, telling her in the only way Samuel ever told anyone anything important, that he had decided this place was home. "I'm going to handle it," she said again. "Trust me." He looked at her for a long moment. "I do," he said, simply. The way Samuel said everything that mattered, without decoration. She told Luke that night. She waited until after the boys were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, and the only sound was the fire and the wind doing its usual business with the eaves, and then she went to the drawer and took out the letter and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. She sat down across from him. "I received that 4 days ago," she said. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't, and I want to explain why." He picked up the letter. He read it slowly, carefully, the way Luke did everything, giving it the full weight of his attention. When he finished, he set it down. Teaching position, he said. In Laramie. Permanent with housing. Good salary. Generous. He was quiet. He looked at the letter on the table between them, and then he looked at her, and his face was the most carefully neutral she had seen it since the first day on the platform in Cheyenne. And she understood that he was controlling it the way he always controlled things that mattered, not hiding them exactly, but holding them still enough to think clearly. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" he asked. "Because I needed to know what I wanted before I told you," she said. "I didn't want to bring you a problem I hadn't thought through. I didn't want you to—" She paused. "I didn't want you to feel obligated to react in a particular way before you knew how I was thinking about it." He held her eyes. "How are you thinking about it?" "I'm thinking about what it means that I've had it in that drawer for 4 days," she said. "What it means that I've walked past it 20 times and not once picked it up and started calculating what we'd need to move." She paused. "When Robert died and I had to figure out what to do next, I made lists. I'm a list maker. I calculated everything. I still have the notebook where I worked out every option in that first terrible month." She looked at the letter on the table. "I haven't made a single calculation about Laramie." Luke was very still. "I want to know what you want," she said. "Not what you think I should have, or what the practical answer is, or what makes the most sense given the arrangement we started with. What you actually want." The fire shifted. The lamp sent its small, steady light across the table between them. "I want you to stay," he said. No elaboration, no cushioning around it. Just the plain statement delivered in the quiet voice of a man who has decided that whatever he's afraid of is less than what he would lose by being indirect. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you hung Eleanor's curtains," he said. "And you kept the extra wood when I told you we didn't need it, and you were right and you never said so. Because Samuel found something in my books that I missed for 2 years, and you sent him to tell me instead of telling me yourself. Because you understood he needed to be the one to do it." He paused. "Because Noah doesn't have nightmares anymore. Because Ethan said sir to me last Tuesday, and I don't think he knows I noticed." Another pause. "Because this kitchen has been warm since October, and it wasn't warm before that. Not in 5 years." Abigail looked at the table. "I want you to stay," he said again, "and I want you to stay because you want to, not because the arrangement requires it, or the situation makes it logical. I want to know that you're choosing this." She looked up at him. "I'm choosing this," she said. The simplicity of it. 4 words after 4 months of careful navigation and managed distances and things stated without being stated landed between them with the weight of everything it had taken to arrive at it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Neither of them said anything else. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows, and inside the lamp burned warm and low, and somewhere in the house, her 4 sons slept the deep sleep of children who have, without being told, understood that the place they are in is safe. The next morning, she wrote to the school board in Laramie and declined the position. She did it at the kitchen table before anyone else was awake with her good pen and the good paper she kept for important correspondence, and she wrote clearly and without hesitation and sealed the envelope and set it on the counter to go out with the next mail. Then she made coffee and started breakfast. And when Luke came in from the early check and saw the envelope on the counter, he glanced at it and then at her, and she said, "It's done." And he said, "All right," and poured himself coffee, and that was the whole of it. Samuel came down for breakfast and saw the envelope too. He looked at his mother. She gave him one small nod. He sat down at the table and opened his ledger and didn't say another word about it, and Abigail thought that boy understands more about how the world works than most adults she had ever known. Jacob ate 4 biscuits and talked about Sheriff the Barn Cat's recent political decisions and the ongoing territorial disputes between the barn cats and the chickens, which he was currently documenting in a notebook he had titled The Wyoming Chronicles Volume 1, in case anyone needed a reference. Noah ate his breakfast and then climbed down from his chair and went and stood beside Luke and said, "Are we going to look at the horses this morning?" After I finish my coffee, Luke said. Noah sat back down and folded his hands on the table with the exaggerated patience of a 6-year-old waiting out the last 3 minutes of something. Abigail watched all of this, the ordinary, irreplaceable, entirely specific texture of this particular morning in this particular kitchen, and she thought, yes, this was the answer. This had always been the answer. She had just needed the drawer and the 4 days and the conversation at the table to stop arguing with it. What she did not know yet, what none of them knew yet on that ordinary morning, was that things were about to stop being ordinary. The storm came with almost no warning. It had been a hard winter already, the kind of winter that announces itself early and then spends the following months proving its intentions. But in the last week of January, the temperature dropped in a single day from cold to dangerous and kept going, and the sky went the color of iron, and the wind developed a purpose to it that was different from the usual Wyoming wind, not wandering, but directed, carrying the specific weight of what was coming. Cade read the signs first. He came to the kitchen door on the morning of the 23rd and said quietly, but without room for argument, "Something's coming in from the northwest. Bad one. We need to move the cattle from the north pasture today." Luke was already thinking the same thing. He had the hands organized and the horses ready inside an hour. The plan was straightforward. Move the cattle from the exposed north pasture to the more sheltered eastern draws, a drive that would take most of the day in good conditions and was going to take considerably longer in the conditions that were developing. Ethan said he was going. Abigail started to argue. She looked at her 16-year-old son standing in the kitchen doorway with his jaw set and his coat on and his gloves already in his hand, and she thought, he is not asking permission. He has not been asking permission for a while now. He is telling her because he respects her enough to tell her, not because he requires her approval. She looked at Luke. Luke looked at Ethan. "You stay close," he said. "You hear me? You don't go off on your own for any reason." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Samuel stood up from the breakfast table. "I'll go too." "Samuel," Abigail said. "He's useful," Luke said. He said it to Abigail directly, not around her. "He knows the count on the north herd because he's been doing the records. I want him with me so we know if we're short any head when we get them moved." He paused. "I'll keep them both with me." Abigail looked at her 2 oldest sons, 16 and 13, both of them watching her with that particular quality of attention that meant they were reading her, the way she always read rooms, for what was real, for what mattered, for what she was actually deciding. "Come home," she said. Ethan nodded. Samuel nodded. They left with Luke and Cade and Reuben before 10 in the morning. Dutch stayed behind. His shoulder was still unreliable in cold, and Luke needed him at the ranch to help with the animals that remained. Abigail put Dutch to work and kept herself busy with things that needed doing, and she tracked the hours the way she had tracked hours during Robert's illness, by task, not by clock, because tracking by clock was a way of making the waiting larger than it needed to be. Jacob helped her, unsolicited, quietly, without his usual running commentary, which told her more about Jacob's understanding of the situation than anything he could have said. He knew something serious was happening. He showed his understanding the only way Jacob knew how, which was by doing whatever needed doing and not making noise about it. Noah stayed close to the house, close to her. The storm hit at mid-afternoon. It did not ease its way in. It arrived at full force the way Wyoming storms had a way of arriving without transition, as though the weather had been standing on the other side of a door and someone had simply opened it. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees inside an hour. The wind went horizontal. Dutch came in to report that the visibility was near nothing at the far end of the yard and still dropping. They had been out there for 6 hours. Abigail stood at the window and watched the gray-white nothing of the storm and felt the particular brand of fear that she had carried in various forms for most of her adult life, the fear of someone who loves people who are out in the world where she cannot reach them. She had felt it through Robert's illness. She had felt it on the train to Wyoming. She felt it now at a different pitch and frequency, sharper, because Luke was out there, and so were her sons, and she was standing in a warm kitchen, completely unable to do anything useful. "They know what they're doing," Dutch said from behind her. "I know," she said. Luke's been running cattle in bad weather for 20 years. I know that too. He was quiet. Then he said, You want me to go look for them? No, she said. Stay here. She paused. If Dutch goes out and doesn't come back, we're in a worse situation than we started with. Dutch blinked. Then he said, That's a very practical way to think about it. I'm a practical woman, she said. She kept watching the window. Jacob appeared beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, shoulder pressed against her arm, the way he used to stand beside her when he was small and something frightened him. He was 10 years old, and he was still her boy. And she covered the top of his head briefly with her hand without comment, and they both kept watching the nothing outside the window. Noah was at the kitchen table. He had gotten his own blanket from upstairs and wrapped himself in it, and was sitting very still in the way he sat when he was afraid, compacted, contained, working very hard at something internal. They're coming back, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Abigail said. She said it with the certainty she used when certainty was what was needed, regardless of what certainty could be confirmed. I know, Noah said. Because Mr. Luke promised. Abigail turned. When did he promise? This morning, Noah said. Before they left, he came and found me in the barn, and he said, Noah's face tightened briefly, then smoothed out. He said, I'm going to bring your brothers home safe, and I'm going to come back myself, and I need you to take care of your mother while we're gone. And I said I would. The kitchen was very quiet. So I'm taking care of you, Noah said with complete seriousness. Abigail looked at her youngest son sitting wrapped in his blanket at the kitchen table, 6 years old, solemnly discharging a promise he had been given by a man he had decided to love with the whole of his uncomplicated heart. Dutch made a noise that wasn't quite a cough. Abigail turned back to the window. They came back after dark. She heard the horses before she could see anything, that particular sound of hooves on frozen ground muffled by the wind, but real, unmistakably real. She was at the door before Dutch could get up from the chair, throwing it open against the storm's resistance, and the cold hit her like a wall. Luke came through the gate first. He was carrying someone. It took her 2 seconds, 2 of the longest seconds of her life, to see that it was Ethan. Ethan, who was her tallest child, her grown nearly to a man-child, and he was hanging in Luke's arms with his head against Luke's shoulder and his eyes closed. And for those 2 seconds, Abigail Harper did not breathe. Then Ethan moved. He lifted his head and squinted against the light from the door and said in a voice that was tired and roughened and entirely alive, Ma, I'm fine. He wouldn't let me walk. Your feet are frozen, Luke said. His own voice was raw from the cold. You don't walk on frozen feet. I could have walked. No, Luke said. You couldn't. He carried Ethan through the door and into the kitchen and set him down in the chair closest to the stove, and Samuel came in behind them, and Cade behind Samuel and Reuben, last pulling the door shut against the storm, and the kitchen was suddenly full of cold and snow and people, and the particular sound of everyone breathing too hard and alive. Abigail went directly to Ethan's feet. His boots came off, and she looked at what she found, and her hands stayed steady, even though her chest was not steady at all. The toes were white and waxy, not the worst it could be, but bad enough. She had seen frostbite before. She knew what needed to happen. Get snow, she said to Dutch. Not too much. Pack it gently around his feet, don't rub. Ma, Ethan said. Ma, I'm fine. I know you're fine, she said. Stay still anyway. She looked up at Luke. He was standing 2 feet away watching her work, and he was exhausted in a way she could see down to the bone. The kind of exhaustion that comes from cold and effort and something else. Something that came from the inside rather than the outside. He had taken his hat off. He was holding it in both hands. He went after a heifer that went through a gap in the draw, Luke said. His voice was quiet. The ground gave way on him. He was in the snow up to his knees before I reached him. He told me not to come after him, Ethan said from the chair. I went anyway. Yeah, Luke said. You did. The heifer? We got her, Luke said. She's in the south barn. Count is good. Samuel knew the count, Ethan said with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just proven something he believed in. He did, Luke said. He looked at Abigail, and something in his expression was raw, the way his voice was raw, scraped open by the cold, and the hours, and the fear that she understood even without him saying it. He had been carrying every minute he was out there with her sons. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. "The visibility dropped faster than I expected." "You brought them back," she said. "It took too long." "Luke?" She stood up. She was still holding Ethan's wool sock in her hand. "You brought them back. That's what matters." He looked at her. And then right there in the kitchen with Dutch packing snow around Ethan's feet, and Samuel sitting against the wall drinking water, with both hands wrapped around the cup, and Reuben and Cade shedding their frozen coats by the door, and Jacob standing beside the stove with his arms crossed, watching everything with enormous eyes, and Noah standing absolutely still in the center of the room. Luke Mercer put both hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lowered them. His face was controlled again, but she had seen it. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his arm. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her. "They're safe," she said quietly. "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know they are." Noah walked across the kitchen and stood in front of Luke and held his arms up. Luke looked down at him for a second. Then he picked him up, and Noah wrapped both arms around Luke's neck and held on, and Luke stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding a 6-year-old, and breathing, just breathing, and Abigail stepped back and let them have that. What had happened in that storm? What Abigail understood in the following hours sitting with Ethan while the color came back into his feet, and the feeling came back with a pain that made the boy go white and clench his jaw and not cry out, because Ethan would die before he cried out, was not just that Luke had brought her sons home. It was the manner of the bringing. It was what Ethan told her when the others were occupied elsewhere, and it was just the two of them in the kitchen, and he was past the worst of the pain, and his voice was quiet and honest, the way it got when his guard came down from exhaustion. "He came after me before I hit the bottom of the drift," Ethan said. "I don't know how. I don't know how he even saw me go down. The visibility was that bad. But he was there before I'd even started to figure out how to get myself out." He stopped. "He's the one who went in up to his own knee to pull me. Not Cade. Not Reuben. Luke." He looked at his feet, wrapped now and slowly warming. "He didn't say anything. He didn't make a thing of it. He just pulled me out and said, 'Can you put weight on it?' And when I couldn't, he picked me up, and that was that." Abigail said nothing. "I'm 16 years old," Ethan said. "Almost a man. He carried me." "He did," she said. "I didn't argue about it." He looked at her. "I didn't argue, Ma. And I think about what I would have done if Pa had done that, or anyone before. I would have argued." He paused. "I trusted him to carry me." She looked at her son. "What does that mean?" he asked. And for a moment, just a moment, he was not the 17-year-old who had taken on the weight of the family, not the armored boy who had built his walls before he'd barely finished growing. He was asking his mother a real question with the uncertainty of someone who has been handed an experience they don't yet have the framework to understand. "It means you trust him," she said gently. Ethan was quiet. "I think I might," he said. She put her hand on his arm. He let her. He was tired enough and shaken enough that the armor was down the rest of the way, and he was just her boy, her firstborn, Robert's boy. And she let herself be grateful for it and held it carefully, because she knew it wouldn't stay open this long once he'd rested. "Get some sleep," she said. He was asleep in the chair within 10 minutes. She covered him with a blanket and let him stay there by the stove where it was warm. That night, after everyone else was asleep, Luke sat at the kitchen table, and Abigail sat across from him, and he told her what it had actually been like out there, not the version he'd told in the kitchen with the boys listening, but the real one. The 20 minutes after Ethan went down, when the visibility was so bad he could barely see Cade 3 feet away. The moment he heard Samuel's voice calling through the wind and couldn't immediately locate the direction. The particular quality of fear that comes when you are responsible for people. You and he stopped at that word and looked at the table and then kept going. When you are responsible for people, and the situation has moved outside your ability to control it. I thought about you, he said. The whole time we were out there, I kept thinking. He stopped. She trusted them to me. All 4 of them, and she trusted me to bring them back. You did, she said. This time, he said. Luke. I'm not. He held up a hand. I'm not falling apart. I'm being honest with you, because that's what we do. He looked at her. I want you to know what it's like for me. When they're out there, and they're mine to bring back. She held very still. Theirs, he said. To bring back. I don't mean to assume. Luke, she said. He stopped. They've been yours for a while, she said. If you're willing. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the storm was quieting, the worst of it passing, the wind dropping from its high, sustained howl to something more ordinary. The fire had burned down to coals. I'm willing, he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the same way he had covered hers 3 weeks before, over the letter from Laramie. They sat like that for a while in the fading warmth of the kitchen. In the morning, Ethan came to the breakfast table under his own power, moving carefully on tender feet, but moving. He sat down. He accepted coffee. He had started drinking coffee recently, and Abigail had decided not to comment on it. He looked across the table at Luke. Thank you, he said. Luke looked at him. Don't mention it. I'm mentioning it, Ethan said. Once, and then I won't again, but I'm mentioning it. A beat. All right, Luke said. Ethan nodded. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table and then back up at Luke. The south fence line is going to need checking after the storm. I'll go this afternoon if my feet are better. I'll go with you, Luke said. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway with his ledger under his arm. He looked at his brother's feet, then at Luke, then at Abigail. He sat down, opened his ledger, and said, I found 2 more entries that don't match. Everyone looked at him. In the records, he said, from before. 2 more instances where the count doesn't correspond to the sale record. He turned the ledger so Luke could see. I think there's a 3rd person involved, not just Greer. Luke leaned over the numbers. His face went still and careful. Show me, he said. Samuel showed him. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the wind that was dying outside, and the sound of 2 people, a man of 42 and a boy of 13, working through numbers together with the focused patience of people who understand that evidence is how you beat men like Charles Whitmore. And evidence requires precision, and precision requires time, and they had the time because they were not going anywhere. Abigail refilled coffees and did not interrupt them, and thought about the 3rd person Samuel believed was involved, and something moved through her mind. A small, cold thing like a stone dropping into still water. She thought about who had known this land well enough to know where to cut the fence. She thought about what Ethan had said. Someone who knew this ranch, or someone told by someone who did. She thought about the 18 months between when Greer had left the territory and when Whitmore's man had first come to the ranch. She thought about timing. She thought about what you did with 18 months if you were building toward something. She set down the coffee pot. Luke, she said. He looked up. Samuel, she said. In those records, is there anyone else's name that appears consistently in the same entries where the counts don't match? Samuel looked at the ledger. He turned back 2 pages, then 1 more. His brow furrowed. There's a witness signature on the transfer records, he said slowly. Same name each time. He looked. He looked again. He said yes. What name? Luke asked. Samuel looked up. He said a name. Luke went absolutely still. Abigail watched his face and saw the moment of recognition move across it, the particular expression of a man who has just had a gap in understanding filled in a way that rearranges everything around it. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the terrible clarity that comes when something you suspected but couldn't prove stops being a suspicion. Who is it? she asked. Luke looked at her. His voice was very even. Reuben, he said. The name landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a great height. Reuben, who had worked the Mercer Ranch for 4 years. Reuben, who had been out in the storm yesterday with Luke and her sons, and had come back through the door and stood at the kitchen stove to warm himself and eaten supper at this table last night. Reuben, whose name was on every suspicious transfer record Samuel had just traced in the same handwriting, with the same pen pressure on the same days, the numbers didn't match. Jacob, who had come downstairs in the last 5 minutes and was standing in the doorway eating a cold biscuit from last night, said, "Who's Reuben?" "Someone we need to talk to," Luke said. He stood up from the table. "Stay here," he said. He said it to all of them, but he was looking at Abigail. "All of you, stay in the house." Luke. Abigail. His voice was controlled and quiet. "Please." She looked at him. She sat down. He walked out of the kitchen, and they heard his boots on the porch steps, and then nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. Noah, who had come downstairs during the last 2 minutes and was standing at the bottom of the stairs, with his blanket still wrapped around him, said, "Is something bad happening? Something's being handled," Abigail said. Her voice was steady. She looked at her 4 sons in various positions around the kitchen. Ethan sitting forward with his jaw tight. Samuel with his hand flat on the open ledger, as though holding the evidence in place. Jacob standing in the doorway. Noah at the bottom of the stairs. "Come sit down," she said. "All of you. Breakfast." "Ma," Ethan started. "Breakfast," she said. "Luke is handling it. Our job is to be ready when he comes back." They sat down. She put food on the table. Her hands were steady. Her heart was running a great deal faster than steady, but her hands knew what to do, and she let them do it, because this was what you did when you were the steady one. You were steady regardless of what was happening underneath, and you kept the kitchen warm and the table set, and the people around you fed and present and ready for what came next. Outside, across the cold Wyoming morning, Luke Mercer was walking toward the bunkhouse. And whatever was about to happen would happen, and they would face it, all 6 of them, the way they had been facing things since October. Together. Luke was gone for 40 minutes. Abigail knew because Noah was tracking it. He had positioned himself at the kitchen table with a clear line of sight to the window and was counting under his breath, in the particular way he counted things when he was nervous. Not out loud, not obtrusively. Just the small movement of his lips that she recognized and had learned not to interrupt because the counting was what he did instead of panicking, and she respected it. Jacob ate his breakfast. All of it, and then whatever was left on Samuel's plate, because Jacob's response to tension was appetite, and she let him eat because food was something she could give him right now. Samuel sat with his hand still flat on the open ledger. He had not moved it. He was looking at the name written there in a handwriting he had spent 3 weeks learning to read and cross-reference, and his face had the expression it got when he was reworking a calculation. Not upset, not frightened, but deeply, intensely focused on understanding the new shape of something. Ethan had not sat back down after Luke left. He was standing at the window. He hadn't been asked to sit, and she hadn't asked him again because she understood that Ethan standing at that window was as close to standing beside Luke as he could get right now, and she wasn't going to take that from him. When Luke's footsteps finally came up the porch steps, every person in that kitchen went still. He came through the door alone. He stood for a moment in the kitchen. He looked at Abigail. "Reuben's gone," he said. The silence that followed had several layers to it. "Gone," Abigail said. "His gear is out of the bunkhouse. Horse is gone from the stall." Luke's voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it, not surprise, and that was its own thing to hear. "He must have left sometime in the night, after the storm dropped enough to ride." "He knew," Samuel said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. She could tell it came from the calculation running in his head and escaped before he decided to speak. He looked up. "He knew we were getting close. The ledger work, we've been doing it every morning at this table. If he was watching..." "He was watching," Luke said. "I should have been more careful about where we worked." "It's not your fault," Abigail said. "I'm not saying it's my fault," he said. "I'm saying I'll be more careful going forward." He came and sat down at the table. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Samuel. Everything you found is still there. Him leaving doesn't change the documentation. It might actually help. A man who runs is a man who knows he's guilty. Samuel processed this. For the lawyer in Laramie. For the lawyer in Laramie, Luke confirmed. I'm going to write to him today with everything we have. The discrepancies, the dates, the signature pattern, the fence cutting, the contaminated troughs. All of it goes in one letter, and it goes out today. He paused. Kate and Dutch are the witnesses who need to put their names on this. I need to talk to them. Dutch will, Abigail said immediately. I know. He almost smiled. Cade will too. He's been wanting to say what he knows about Greer for a while. He was just waiting for it to be time. He looked at the table. I want this done properly. I want it done in a way that Whitmore can't undo. Ethan turned from the window. What about Whitmore himself? Luke looked at him. Reuben worked for you, Ethan said, but he was Whitmore's arrangement. Reuben leaving doesn't... He paused, finding the words. Reuben was the evidence that Whitmore had someone on the inside. If he's gone, does that hurt the case? Luke was quiet for a moment. He looked at the 16-year-old standing at his kitchen window with his tender feet and his working brain, and that relentless insistence on understanding the full situation. And his expression was something Abigail couldn't entirely name. Pride was part of it, she thought, though Luke wouldn't have used that word. It complicates it, Luke said honestly. But it doesn't end it. Reuben's signature is in those records. His absence from the territory is its own statement. And the attorney may have ways of locating him that we don't. He paused. What Reuben running tells us is that Whitmore knows we're building something, which means Whitmore is going to move faster now. The kitchen was quiet. How fast? Abigail asked. I don't know, Luke said. But I think we're going to find out soon. He was right. 2 days after Reuben disappeared, a writer came from Cheyenne with a letter. Not from Whitmore this time, from the land office. A formal notice of a competing claim on a section of the Mercer Ranch's eastern boundary, filed under a provision Abigail had never heard of, and Luke had not encountered before. The claim was technical, the language dense, and the signature at the bottom was a name she did not recognize. But the address attached to the legal representative was an office in Cheyenne, that when Luke rode to town the next morning and came back 4 hours later, with the particular tight-jawed look she had learned to read, turned out to belong to an attorney retained exclusively by Charles Whitmore. He's claiming the boundary survey from 18 years ago was inaccurate, Luke said. He set the papers on the kitchen table. He's saying there's a strip of eastern land about 40 acres that the original survey placed incorrectly and that by right belongs to the neighboring property. Abigail looked at the papers. Is he right? No, Luke said. The survey is solid. I have the original documentation. He paused. But challenging it in the land office means hearings, time, money for legal representation. He looked at her. It's not about whether he can win. It's about whether he can make winning expensive enough that I'd rather settle. Settle meaning selling him the water rights, she said. Or more, he said. She looked at the papers on the table. She thought about the letter in the drawer that she had declined 3 weeks ago and what it would have meant for the Mercer Ranch if she had accepted it and taken her sons to Laramie. It would have meant Luke facing this alone. The thought sat cold in her stomach. What does your Laramie attorney say? She asked. I sent everything yesterday. I haven't heard back yet. He paused. But I want your read on something. Tell me. The boundary claim is weak, he said. I know it's weak, and Whitmore knows it's weak, and his attorney knows it's weak. So why file it now? Why this specific move right now? She thought about it. She thought about what she knew of men like Whitmore, the pattern of them, the logic beneath the surface aggression. She thought about timing. Because Reuben left, she said. He lost his inside source. He knows we've found the ledger discrepancies. He can't win the fight on the fraud angle because we have documentation, and he knows it. She looked up. So he's opening a second front. Something that doesn't touch the fraud. Something separate that he can fight on different ground. Luke was watching her. He's not trying to win everything, she said. He's trying to split your attention. Make you fight on two fronts with limited resources and see which one you drop. She paused. What he doesn't know is that you're not fighting alone anymore. The words landed in the kitchen, and neither of them looked away from the other. No, Luke said. I'm not. That afternoon, Samuel wrote out a clean summary of every discrepancy he had found in the ledgers, organized by date by entry, by the magnitude of the difference between the recorded count and what the transfer documents showed. He wrote it in his best hand, numbered each entry, and signed his name at the bottom with the seriousness of someone who understood that his name on a document meant something. He brought it to Luke when it was done. Luke read through it in full. When he finished, he looked at Samuel for a long moment and then said, "This is thorough." "I made sure not to assume anything that isn't in the numbers," Samuel said. "If I couldn't document it, I didn't include it." "That's the right way to do it," Luke said. He set the document down. Samuel. "Sir, when you're older..." Luke stopped. "No. When this is over, I want to talk to you about what you want to do with your life. Because you have a specific kind of mind that is..." He paused again, choosing carefully. "I think you should know that what you've done here is not something most adults would have caught. Most adults wouldn't have known to look for the pattern. Most wouldn't have been able to explain it this clearly once they found it." He held the boy's eyes. "You should know that." Samuel stood very still. He was not a boy who flushed or showed sentiment easily, but something moved across his face. Something he didn't quite manage to keep out. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," Luke said. "I mean it." Samuel picked up the ledger and went back to the table, and Abigail, who had been standing at the stove the whole time, pretending to be doing something with a pot that didn't require doing, turned away and looked at the wall until her eyes were behaving themselves again. The response from the Laramie attorney arrived on a Friday morning. It was longer than she expected and more forceful than Luke had been letting himself hope for. The attorney, a man named Aldrich, whom Luke had described as cautious and methodical, which Abigail took to mean exactly the kind of man you wanted, had reviewed the documentation Samuel had assembled and had written back with 3 pages of very specific opinion. The ledger discrepancies were, in Aldrich's view, not ambiguous. The signature pattern was not ambiguous. The departure of a man whose name appeared on every suspicious entry in the immediate aftermath of the investigation becoming visible was not ambiguous. He recommended filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Authority, not just about the fraudulent cattle records, but about the fence cutting and the contaminated troughs, which he believed could be tied to Whitmore's operation through Reuben's connection. He also addressed the boundary claim directly and used a word about it that made Luke read the sentence twice. "He says frivolous," Luke said. "Good," Abigail said. "He says he can have it dismissed within 30 days if we send him the original survey documentation." "Then send it today," she said. "I intend to." Luke set the letter down. He looked at her across the kitchen. "He also says..." He paused. "What?" "He says the strength of our position is the documentation. The more thorough and organized it is, the faster this moves." Luke looked at the ledger that was sitting on the counter where Samuel had left it. "He wants the original ledger, the summary Samuel wrote, and a sworn statement from Cade." He paused. "He wants a statement from you, too." She blinked. "From me? About what you overheard when Whitmore was here. The conversation on the porch." Luke held her gaze. "Aldrich says your account of what Whitmore said about you, the way he said it, the tone in the context of a man who was there to apply pressure about a business dispute, establishes a pattern of behavior that helps build the character picture of who Whitmore is." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He wants to use the fact that Whitmore called me substantial," she said. "He wants to use the fact that a man who came here ostensibly to make a business offer used a woman's appearance to pressure a man into compliance," Luke said. His voice was steady. "Which is what it was." She looked at the table. She thought about the morning she had stood at the stove and directed her anger carefully, the way she always directed it, not scattering it, not suppressing it, but keeping it pointed at something useful. She thought about the word substantial delivered in that smooth, social tone, by a man who used people the way tools used, the way a carpenter used a hammer efficiently and without particular feeling. "I'll write it," she said. She wrote it that afternoon. 2 pages clear and specific in the same careful tone she'd used in the original letter to Luke, honest, precise, without drama, which was, she had come to understand, far more damaging to a man like Whitmore than anger would ever be. Anger could be dismissed. Precise, calm documentation of specific behavior was considerably harder to argue with. When Luke read it, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "This is good." "I know," she said. She wasn't being immodest. She was being accurate, and they both understood the difference. Everything went to Laramie the next morning. The week that followed was the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you have done everything you can do, and the outcome is now in other hands, and the only available action is to keep running the ranch and keep feeding people and keep the fire going and not allow the waiting to become the thing that held the household. She did not allow it. She kept the schedule. She kept the lessons for the boys daily because she had promised herself when they left Colorado Springs that education would not be sacrificed to circumstance, and she was not breaking that promise now. She kept the kitchen producing 3 meals a day. She kept the accounts she had taken over the day-to-day household accounting from Luke because she was faster and more systematic, and he had admitted this without embarrassment, which she found unreasonably endearing. She also, in the second week of February, began quietly making connections in Cheyenne. This was not a strategy she announced. It was simply something she did in the way she did most things, practically without ceremony building from what was available. She had been going into Cheyenne once a week for supplies since they arrived, and over the months she had developed the specific knowledge of a woman who pays attention to what people say and how they say it and what they're not saying when they're saying something else. She knew which merchants were indebted to Whitmore's patronage and which ones resented it. She knew which families had been pressured by his expansion in the past 3 years and which ones had held. She knew that the postmaster whose careful neutrality she had initially read as compliance was actually the careful neutrality of a man who was waiting to see which way things fell before committing to a position. She started talking to people, not about Whitmore directly, about the territory, about the kind of men who built it and the kind of men who used it, about what a community looked like when it was healthy, and what it looked like when one operation had grown powerful enough to squeeze the smaller ones out. She was good at this, at conversation that built something without appearing to be building anything, and the women of Cheyenne who had initially received her with the measured wariness of a community evaluating a newcomer had by February begun to receive her with something considerably warmer. The wife of the feed store owner told her one afternoon, almost in passing, that her husband had been waiting 2 months for a payment from Whitmore's operation that kept being delayed for reasons that shifted each time he asked about it. The wife of the livery owner told her that a neighboring rancher, a small operation, a family with 3 children, had sold out to Whitmore 6 months ago under circumstances that everyone in town described as a fair offer, and that the rancher himself described, when he'd had enough whiskey to be honest, as an offer he hadn't felt he could refuse. The schoolteacher, a brisk woman of about 60, with the direct manner of someone who has taught other people's children long enough to have stopped pretending about the nature of things, told her flatly that Charles Whitmore had been on the school board for 4 years, and that every time a teacher in the territory applied for a position that Whitmore had an opinion about, the opinion tended to prevail. Abigail listened to all of it. She didn't share what she was doing with Luke immediately, not because she was hiding it, but because she was still deciding what shape it should take. She was building something, and she needed to know what it was before she brought it to him. She found out on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of February, when she stopped at the general store, and found 3 women in conversation near the door who went quiet when she came in. This was no longer the going quiet of people discussing her. She knew that quiet, and it had a different quality. This was the going quiet of people who had been discussing something they hadn't decided to share yet. She bought her goods. She said good morning. One of the women, Margaret Howell, whose husband ran the largest feed supply in the territory, and who had been one of the first women to receive Abigail with genuine warmth, walked her to the door. On the threshold, Margaret said quietly, "There's talk that Whitmore is moving to have the Mercer water rights declared a public resource, under a territorial provision. He's been talking to men at the land office." Abigail went still. "That's different from buying them," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. "It's very different. Buying them would mean paying for them. A public resource declaration would mean—" "He'd have access to them without paying anything," Abigail said. "And Luke would have no recourse because you can't fight a public resource claim the same way you fight a private one." Margaret held her eyes. "That's what my husband says." "When did this start?" "The conversation at the land office, about 3 weeks ago." Margaret paused. "Around the time Whitmore's man rode out to your ranch the second time, I'd expect." "Around the time Reuben disappeared. Around the time the boundary claim was filed. A third front, and this one was the most dangerous of all. Not a direct attack that could be defended directly, but a legal mechanism that bypassed property rights entirely." Abigail thanked Margaret. She kept her face pleasant. She got in the wagon and drove back to the ranch. She told Luke before her coat was off. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to every word, and his face went through 3 things in quick succession recognition. Because this fit the pattern. Then calculation, because Luke's mind moved immediately to what could be done. Then something darker, because what could be done was not immediately clear, and he knew it. "He's been planning this longer than the boundary claim," Luke said. "Yes," she said. "The boundary claim was a distraction," he said. "Something for Aldrich to deal with. Something to take our attention east while he was building this western approach." He moved to the table and sat down. "A public resource declaration on the water rights. If he gets that through, the eastern 40 acres don't matter. The fraud documentation doesn't matter. He can access our water without owning it, and there is nothing we can do about it legally." "Unless," Abigail said. He looked at her. "Unless the documentation we already have, the fraud, the pattern of coercion, the fence cutting the contaminated water, the pressure tactics, unless all of that constitutes a pattern of bad faith manipulation of the regulatory process." She held his eyes. "Aldrich said the character picture matters. What if the character picture is the case?" Luke was still. "You're saying we don't fight the water rights claim on its merits," he said slowly. "I'm saying we fight Whitmore's ability to make any claims at all," she said. "We put in front of the territorial authority not just the ledger fraud, but the complete pattern, every incident, every pressure tactic, the boundary claim that Aldrich called frivolous, and now this. We argue that Charles Whitmore has been engaged in a systematic effort to acquire the Mercer Ranch's assets through fraud, intimidation, and regulatory manipulation, and that his fitness to bring any claim before any land authority in this territory should be questioned." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's a bigger fight," Luke said. "Yes," she said. "It's also the only fight that ends this. You could win on the boundary claim and he files something else next month. You could defend the water rights and he finds another provision. There will always be another provision, Luke. The only way to stop it is to make him too costly to fight with." She paused. "If the territorial authority is looking at a pattern of fraudulent and coercive behavior, they're not just looking at one claim. They're looking at a man." Luke sat with this for a long moment. She let him sit with it. Then he said, "I need to write to Aldrich tonight." "I already started," she said. He blinked. She went to the counter and picked up the 2 pages she had begun in the wagon on the way back from Cheyenne, written while the horse found its own way home, because she had spent enough months on that road that the horse required no guidance. She set them in front of him. He read them. He read them twice. When he looked up, something in his face was she didn't have a word for it immediately. She found it eventually undone. Not in distress, in something simpler and deeper than distress. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "We can say all of that later. Right now we need to finish the letter." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned back to the pages. They worked until past midnight. The letter they produced was 8 pages long. It was the most complete account of everything that had happened since October. The ledger discrepancies: Samuel had found the fence cutting the contaminated water. The visit from Garrett. The visit from Whitmore. What Abigail had overheard Reuben's departure. The frivolous boundary claim, and now the water rights maneuvering that Margaret Howell had reported. They attached Samuel's organized summary and the sworn statements from Cade and Dutch. They attached Abigail's original account. At the end, Luke wrote one additional paragraph in his own words, and he wrote it last after everything else, and he read it to her before he sealed the envelope. This letter represents the account of every person living and working on the Mercer Ranch. He read, I include the account of Mrs. Abigail Harper, who came to this ranch in October of last year with her 4 sons, and who has in the months since contributed materially to its operation, its accounts, and its defense against the pattern of behavior described here. I ask that her account be given the full weight of any principal party to this matter, as that is what she is. He set the letter down. Abigail looked at the table. Any objection? He said. No, she said. Good. He sealed the envelope. The letter went to Laramie the next morning with Cade, who drove it personally, because Luke did not trust the mail for this particular document, and Cade had been waiting since December for a reason to look Aldrich in the face and tell him what he knew about Greer and Reuben, and 4 years of working a ranch where the numbers never quite made sense. The morning Cade left, Ethan came to the kitchen with something in his hand. He set it on the table in front of Abigail. It was a folded piece of paper dense with his handwriting. She looked at it. She looked at him. I wrote down everything I saw from the fence line, he said. The night the section was cut. I was checking the east pasture and I saw tracks the next morning. I know what direction they came from. He paused. I didn't say anything before because I wasn't sure it was useful. I think now it might be. She looked at her son. Ethan, she said. It might help place where Reuben was that night, he said. The tracks came from the direction of the bunkhouse, not the road. I can describe exactly where. She stood up and put both hands on his face and held it for a moment. He went slightly pink and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a 17-year-old enduring maternal contact, but he didn't step back. I'll make sure Cade takes it to Aldrich, she said. I already wrote a clean copy, he said. For the lawyer. He paused. Samuel told me what made documentation useful. I followed his format. Abigail looked at her oldest son, this boy who had carried the family since he was 14, who had stepped onto a train with his jaw set, and his trust locked down, and his hands ready to work, who had said sir to Luke Mercer, because he'd decided the man earned it, and who had now in this kitchen, on this February morning, coordinated with his younger brother to produce legal documentation without anyone asking him to. I'm proud of you, she said. He cleared his throat. It's just a statement, he said. That's not what I'm proud of, she said. He looked at her. I'm proud of you, she said simply. And then she let him go, because he needed to be let go, and he picked up his coat and went out to help Dutch with the morning work, and she watched him go with her heart so full of him it was almost painful. That afternoon, while the boys were at their lessons and the ranch was quiet in the particular way of cold winter afternoons, Luke found her in the front room, standing at the window where Eleanor's curtains hung in the weak February light. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The letter's gone, he said. Cade took Ethan's statement too. Good, she said. He came and stood beside her at the window. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I first wrote back to you to your letter last summer, I told myself it was practical. I told myself I needed help on the ranch. I told myself Eleanor would understand, because it was a sensible arrangement for a man in my situation. He paused. I believed most of that. At least I believed it. She didn't say anything. I don't think it was ever entirely practical, he said. I think something in that letter of yours, the honesty of it, the specific kind of pride in it, I think I knew before I'd finished reading it that I wasn't writing back for practical reasons. He paused. I'd like you to know that. I'd like you to know that whatever else is true about how this started, I wrote back to you because I wanted to write back to you." She looked at the curtains in the window, Eleanor's curtains catching the winter light. She thought about a woman who planted gardens she wouldn't see finished and made her husband promise to keep going, and who had perhaps understood something about the future of this house that the man she left behind hadn't been ready to understand yet. "I'd like to know something," she said. "Ask it," he said. "When this is over, when Aldrich has done what he can do and Whitmore is dealt with one way or another, what do you want?" She turned to look at him. "Not what the ranch needs, not what makes sense. What do you want?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to marry you," he said, as plainly as that. "I want those 4 boys to have my name if they want it. I want Noah to not have to say Mr. Luke anymore." Something shifted in his expression. "I want to stop being careful about distances that don't need to exist anymore." The front room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the house, Jacob was explaining something to Samuel with great enthusiasm, and Samuel was responding with the measured patience of someone who has long since made peace with Jacob being Jacob. Noah's footsteps moved across the floor upstairs. Ethan's voice came from the direction of the barn, calling something to Dutch. The sounds of her family in this house. "Ask me again," she said. "When Whitmore is settled and the ground is clear, ask me again then." He looked at her. "Because I want to say yes when I can say it without anything else in the way," she said. "I've been patient my whole life. I can be patient a little longer." "I'll ask you again," he said. "I know," she said. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. The curtains moved slightly in the draft from the old frame, and outside the Wyoming winter was beginning just barely at the margins of the cold to show the first suggestions of its own ending, that imperceptible shift in the quality of the air that you felt before you could name it. Not spring yet. Not yet. But the waiting had a different quality to it now than it had in October or December or even last month. It was the waiting of people who know what they're waiting for and have decided it's worth every day of it. The following week, 3 things happened in 4 days that changed everything. The first was a letter from Aldrich. It arrived Tuesday morning, and Luke read it standing at the kitchen counter while the coffee boiled. And when he finished, he read it again, and then he set it down very carefully on the counter and said without looking up, "Abigail." She was at the stove. "What?" Aldrich found Reuben. She turned. "He didn't have to look hard," Luke said. He looked up now. "Reuben is in Laramie. He's been in Laramie for 2 weeks. He went directly there." His voice was controlled and strange. "He walked into Aldrich's office 5 days ago and asked to make a statement." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "He's talking," Abigail said. "He's talking," Luke said. "Everything. Greer, the arrangement with Whitmore's man, the fence cutting the troughs. He says Whitmore promised him a position managing one of his operations if he reported on the ranch and helped create conditions that would make selling look attractive." He set the letter down. "He says Whitmore has been doing this with 4 other ranches in the territory over the past 8 years. 2 of them sold. 1 held on. 1—" He stopped. "1 what?" she said. "1 had a fire," Luke said. "In the barn. No one was hurt, but the owner sold the following month." The cold that moved through Abigail's chest had nothing to do with the February air. "He's giving all of this to the territorial authority?" she asked. "Aldrich says he has no choice," Luke said. "If he cooperates fully, and his testimony leads to action against Whitmore, he has a chance of avoiding criminal charges himself. If he doesn't cooperate—" He didn't finish that sentence. "Reuben made a calculation," Samuel said from the table. Luke and Abigail both looked at him. He had been so quiet, they'd both half forgotten he was there. "He made a calculation about which side was more likely to win," Samuel said. "He picked ours." Luke looked at the 13-year-old for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's exactly what he did." "Good," Samuel said. He went back to his book. The second thing happened on Thursday. It was Cade who brought the news riding back from town with the particular posture of a man carrying something significant. He came into the kitchen without knocking, which he never did, and set his hat on the table, which he also never did, and said the land office posted a notice this morning. The water rights claim that Whitmore filed the public resource provision. It's been suspended, pending investigation. Luke stood very still. Aldrich moved fast, Abigail said. Faster than I expected, Luke said. Reuben's statement, she said. Once Aldrich had that, he could connect the water rights filing to the pattern. A regulatory filing made as part of a pattern of fraudulent coercion isn't protected the way a legitimate filing is. She looked at Cade. Was Whitmore's name on the suspension notice? Mentioned in connection, Cade said. Not charged yet, but mentioned. It's starting, Abigail said. The third thing happened on Friday evening, and it was the one she hadn't expected. She had sent Noah and Jacob to wash up for supper, and was setting the table when she heard hoofbeats on the road, a single horse moving at the pace of someone who is not coming with good news, but is coming with news they've decided must be delivered in person. She looked at Luke. He was already moving toward the door. The rider was Margaret Howell's husband. He came up the porch steps and shook Luke's hand and looked at Abigail and said without preamble, Whitmore's left Cheyenne. She blinked. Left how? Luke said. Packed and gone, Howell said. His man Garrett came to the feed store this afternoon and settled every outstanding account, paid in full cash, didn't negotiate. Same thing at the livery. Whitmore's attorney filed a withdrawal of representation this morning at the land office. He paused. Word is Whitmore's already on a train, heading east. The porch was silent. He's running, Ethan said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. Looks like it, Howell said. Without a fight, Ethan said. Men like Whitmore don't fight when they can't control the outcome, Abigail said. Her voice was very steady. He spent 8 years doing this in a territory where he could control the outcome. The moment the authority started looking at the pattern, the moment Reuben talked, he understood the territory had changed. Howell looked at her. He had the expression of a man reassessing something. Mrs. Harper, he said, my wife told me what you've been doing, in town these past months, the conversations. He paused. It mattered. People knowing each other's situations, knowing this wasn't just Mercer's problem, that it was all of ours that mattered when the authorities started asking questions. The other ranchers were ready to talk because they didn't feel alone in it. She held his eyes. Tell your wife I said thank you, she said. He nodded. He shook Luke's hand again. He rode back to Cheyenne. The porch was quiet. Ethan said, It's over. It's largely over, Luke said. Aldrich will want to see it through formally. But Whitmore's gone, and a man who's gone is not a man who's fighting. Ethan stood for a moment. Then he said, Huh. In the tone of someone who spent months preparing for a battle and has arrived at the end of it still standing and is not entirely sure what to do with that. Come eat supper, Abigail said. They went inside. Noah had set the extra place at the table without being asked Dutch's place, because Dutch had started eating with them most evenings, and Noah had at some point decided this was simply how the table was set now. Jacob was already seated and eyeing the bread with the focused attention of a boy who has calculated the optimal moment to reach for the best piece. Samuel sat down and opened the ledger, not to work, just to look at it the way you look at something that has been significant to you, and then closed it and set it aside. Luke sat at the head of the table. Abigail sat across from him. The lamp was lit. The fire was burning. Outside, the Wyoming evening was doing what Wyoming evenings did in February, pressing in cold and absolute against the windows. But inside the kitchen had the warmth of a place that has been deliberately and specifically made warm by people who understand the value of it. Noah looked around the table. Then he looked at Luke. Are you going to ask her? He said. Absolute silence. Luke looked at the 6-year-old. Excuse me, I heard you, Noah said simply. In the front room, when you thought I was upstairs. He looked at Abigail. He's going to ask you something. Are you going to say yes? Abigail looked at her youngest son. Then she looked at Luke. Luke was looking at Noah with an expression that had started as startled, and was now, she could see it. She could trace the movement of it across his face, becoming something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with surprise, and everything to do with this 6-year-old boy, who had decided in the first 48 hours that this was where he belonged, and had never wavered from that decision, and had apparently been doing reconnaissance. "Noah," Abigail said carefully. "I want to know," Noah said, with complete calm. Ethan put his hand over his eyes. Jacob said, "What's happening? Is this a thing? Is this a thing that's happening right now?" Samuel said nothing. He was looking at the table with the careful neutrality of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had decided the best contribution he could make was silence. Luke looked at Abigail. She looked at him. "Well," she said, "the ground seems fairly clear." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he began to smile. Not the almost smile, not the controlled fraction she had spent months drawing out, but the full thing, unguarded, the smile of a man who has been patient a very long time and has arrived somewhere he did not fully let himself believe he would arrive. "Abigail Harper," he said. "Luke Mercer," she said. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. Noah said with profound satisfaction, "Good." Jacob said, "What?" Ethan dropped his hand from his eyes. He looked at Luke. Something moved across his face, slow and real, and earned the way everything with Ethan was earned. Then he picked up his coffee and said in the tone of a man making a considered statement, "About time." Samuel picked up his fork and started eating because that was Samuel, and the matter was settled and supper was getting cold. Abigail looked around the table at her family, all of them, the ones she'd come with, and the one they'd found, and the ones who'd been part of this place before they arrived, and had stayed because of what it had become. And she thought about October, about a train platform in Cheyenne, and a man who touched the brim of his hat and didn't flinch. She thought about Eleanor's curtains, and the extra firewood, and a 6-year-old counting seconds, and a 13-year-old finding things in numbers that men twice his age had missed. She thought about a letter she'd written by candlelight in a room with a table that wobbled. She looked at Luke. He was looking at her. They would have time for all the words later. Right now there was supper and the fire and the sounds of 5 people being alive and loud and present in this kitchen, and outside the Wyoming winter was pressing against the glass, cold and absolute and entirely without power over what was happening inside. The word spread through Cheyenne, the way all important words spread through small territories, not all at once, not through any single announcement, but in the particular way of water, finding its level moving from person to person, through the natural channels of a community that knew everything about everyone and had opinions about all of it. Luke Mercer was getting married, to the widow from Colorado, the one with 4 boys. Abigail became aware of the town's response in stages, the way she had become aware of most things in Cheyenne, through Margaret Howell, who told her directly, which Abigail appreciated, and through the quality of the silence that greeted her in certain establishments, which she had learned to read accurately by now. The response was not uniform. Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the dry goods counter, and had been one of the women talking quietly near the door on that Wednesday in February, received the news with the particular tight pleasantness of a woman revising an opinion she'd rather not revise. She congratulated Abigail with a smile that made it most of the way to her eyes and fell slightly short, and Abigail thanked her with a smile that went considerably farther and meant every inch of it. The schoolteacher, the brisk woman of 60, whose name was Eleanor, which Abigail had learned months ago and had quietly sat with ever since heard the news, and came directly to the mercantile where Abigail was buying fabric, and said without preamble, "I think that's exactly right. He needed someone with sense, and you needed someone worth the effort. It's a sensible match." She paused. "And if anyone tells you otherwise, send them to me." Abigail said, "I appreciate that very much. I'm not being kind," the teacher said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She picked up her own package and left. Howell shook Luke's hand in town on the Monday after Friday's supper table announcement and said, "Good man and nothing else," and that was the kind of endorsement that in Wyoming carried more weight than a speech. Cade heard about it from Dutch, who heard it from Jacob, who had apparently told everyone he encountered from the moment supper was finished, including Reuben's empty bunk, which he addressed directly out of what he described as thoroughness. Cade came to the kitchen door the morning after and stood with his hat in his hands in the way he stood when something mattered to him and said, "Luke Mercer is a lucky man." Abigail said, "Come in for coffee, Cade." He came in. He stayed for an hour. He told her in the measured way he told everything about Eleanor. Not the Eleanor who was the school teacher, but Luke's Eleanor, the one whose curtains hung in the front room, and what she had been like, and what the ranch had been like when she was alive, and what it had been like after. "She would have liked you," Cade said finally. Abigail held her coffee cup and thought about a garden planted by hands that knew they wouldn't see it bloom. "I hope so," she said. "She would have," Cade said. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She had very good judgment about people, bad judgment about weather, and worse judgment about horses. But about people she was rarely wrong. He stood up and put his hat back on. And she made Luke promise to keep going. He looked at Abigail steadily. "I think this is what she meant." He left. Abigail stood at the kitchen window for a while after that, looking at nothing in particular, letting the weight of that settle. The formal business took several more weeks to complete. Aldrich continued his work with the Territorial Authority, and the formal investigation into Whitmore's activities proceeded in the methodical way of such things, slowly, carefully, with the particular thoroughness of institutions that understand that a case built quickly is a case that comes apart quickly. Whitmore remained absent from the territory. His properties were being managed by an agent. His attorney had formally withdrawn representation on all pending claims. The boundary claim was dismissed in the third week of February, exactly as Aldrich had predicted, and the dismissal included language that Aldrich described in his letter as unusually direct for official documentation language that made clear the claim had been filed without merit and in bad faith, and that the filing party's pattern of similar actions in the territory was a matter of active review. Luke read that letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Samuel sitting across from him, and when he finished, he slid it across to Samuel without comment. Samuel read it. He looked up. "Unusually direct," he said, quoting Aldrich. "Yes," Luke said. Samuel looked at the letter again. "That's because of the pattern documentation," he said. "When you show a pattern instead of an incident, it changes what the authority is looking at." "It does," Luke said. Samuel set the letters down. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to study law," he said. It was the first time he had said it to anyone. Abigail was certain she could hear the first-time quality of it, the slight rawness of something being spoken aloud that had previously only existed inside. She stayed very still at the stove. Luke looked at the 13-year-old across the table. "Then you will," he said. "We'll figure out how." Samuel looked at him. "I mean that," Luke said. "I know," Samuel said. He picked up his own copy of the summary he'd been refining and went back to work, and that was the whole conversation. But Abigail understood that something had just shifted in her second son. A door opening inward. The particular movement of a person who has been given permission to want something, and is carefully, and on his own terms, beginning to want it. The investigation reached its first major conclusion in March. Aldrich wrote to say that the Territorial Authority had issued a formal finding against Whitmore's operation. Not criminal charges. Not yet. Those would take longer and depend on whether Whitmore could be brought back to the territory to face them. But a civil finding that constituted the most comprehensive official rebuke of a landowner in the Wyoming Territory in 17 years. 3 other ranching families were named in the finding as having been subjected to the same pattern of coercion. The water rights claim was permanently dismissed. The fraudulent cattle records were officially documented as evidence of financial misconduct. Reuben received a reduced judgment in exchange for his testimony. He left Laramie and was not heard from again in the territory, which suited everyone adequately. Aldrich's final letter on the matter closed with a paragraph that Luke read aloud at supper. The outcome of this matter owes substantially to the quality and organization of the documentation provided by the Mercer Ranch. he read. In particular, the ledger analysis provided by Samuel Harper demonstrates a level of attention and systematic rigor that would be a credit to any trained professional. It is my strong recommendation that this young man's education be pursued with that particular aptitude in mind. The table was silent for a moment. Jacob said, "He's talking about you, Sam." Samuel said, "I know." "He said you're better than a professional." "He said it would be a credit to a professional. That's not the same thing." "It's pretty close." "It's close," Samuel admitted. His ears were red. Ethan from the end of the table said, "Well done." He said it in the tone he used for things that mattered, without volume, without decoration, which in Ethan's vocabulary meant it was more serious than anything louder would have been. Samuel looked at his older brother. "Thanks," he said. Abigail passed the bread and said nothing, and was so full of her children that she genuinely did not know where to put it all. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of May, not because May was particularly meaningful, though the fact that Wyoming was beginning to look like itself again after a hard winter gave it a quality of rightness that Abigail appreciated, but because that was when Aldrich confirmed the last of the legal matters was settled, and Abigail had said she wanted the ground clear, and Luke had said he would ask her again when it was, and he had, and she had said yes with a simplicity and completeness that neither of them felt the need to elaborate on. The planning fell naturally into the pattern of how things got done on the Mercer Ranch, which was to say Abigail made the practical decisions, Luke agreed with all of them, and the boys involved themselves according to their individual natures. Jacob decided he was in charge of the cake, and negotiated this position with the cook from the Cheyenne Hotel, who had agreed to help conducting the negotiation with a seriousness of purpose that the cook, a weathered man of 50 who had worked in establishments from New Orleans to San Francisco, described afterward as the most determined bargaining he had encountered in 30 years. Noah appointed himself responsible for the flowers, and took this responsibility so seriously that Cade, who was not a man who spent time thinking about flowers, found himself 2 weeks before the wedding, holding a detailed list of what grew in the eastern meadow, and being asked to describe each item's color with precision. Cade looked at the list. He looked at Noah. "That one's yellow," he said, pointing. "What kind of yellow?" "The yellow kind." Noah wrote down bright yellow, with the expression of a person making the best of inadequate information. Samuel managed the guest list and the correspondence with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided that if a thing is going to be organized, it should be organized properly, and produced a document that Abigail found so thorough it made her laugh not at Samuel, but with the profound affection of a mother who has watched this particular child apply his particular mind to everything from cattle ledgers to legal evidence, and now to a seating arrangement with exactly the same level of rigor in each case. Ethan built something. He didn't announce he was building it, and he didn't ask for help, and for 2 weeks he worked in the barn in the evening, after the day's work was done. And what emerged was a wooden arch fitted together with the careful joinery of someone who had been paying close attention to how things were built, and had taught himself the relevant skills by the straightforward method of doing them until they worked. He set it up in the yard on the morning of the wedding and stepped back and looked at it. Dutch stood beside him. "That's good work," Dutch said. "It'll hold," Ethan said. "I can see it'll hold," Dutch said. "I said it's good work. Accept the compliment." Ethan looked at the arch. "It's good work," he said. Dutch grinned. "There you go." Luke saw it when he came out of the barn that morning and stopped walking. He stood and looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Ethan, who was examining the joints with the critical eye of a craftsman checking his own output. "Ethan?" he said. Ethan looked up. Luke didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the arch and then back at the boy. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said. The yard was very quiet. Ethan looked at Luke. His face went through something real and unguarded in a way that happened rarely, and was over quickly, but was there unmistakably there. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough. "So am I." Luke said. Ethan looked away. He crouched down and checked the base of the arch where it met the ground, spending a little more time on it than was strictly necessary, because Ethan needed a moment, and he took it the way he took everything, without asking permission, and without making a production of it. When he stood back up, his face was composed again. "It'll hold through the ceremony," he said. "Might need reinforcing if you want to keep it up after." "I want to keep it up after," Luke said. Ethan nodded. "I'll reinforce it next week then." He walked back toward the barn, and Luke watched him go with an expression that Abigail, watching from the kitchen door, would have given a great deal to be able to properly describe. She couldn't find the exact word for it. The closest she could come was a man looking at something he didn't dare let himself have for a long time, realizing he has it. She went back inside and finished dressing. Margaret Howell helped her with her hair. She had offered, and Abigail had accepted, because she had come to think of Margaret as a friend, genuinely the way you think of people as friends, when they've sat across a table from you and been honest with you when honesty was what was needed, and kind when kindness was. "You're beautiful," Margaret said when she was finished. Abigail looked at herself in the glass that had been propped against the wall of the bedroom. She was 35 years old. She was a large woman, and she had made peace with that years ago, not the brittle peace of someone who has suppressed something, but the genuine settled peace of someone who has understood that the body doing the living and the soul doing the living are not in opposition. She had strong hands from years of work. She had gray beginning at her temples. She had the face of a woman who had been through things and come out the other side with her judgment intact and her heart still open, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable. "I'm going to take your word for that," she said. "Don't," Margaret said. "Look properly." She looked. She thought about the woman who had written a letter by candlelight in a room with a wobbling table and had told the truth about every single thing about herself because she was too tired and too old and too much herself to do anything else. That woman was getting married today. "All right," she said. "I see it." Margaret squeezed her shoulders. The ceremony was small. That had been the decision from the beginning. Not because either of them was modest about what was happening, but because what was happening was theirs, and they didn't need a large production to make it real. The people who mattered were there, Cade and Dutch, who stood together with the particular posture of men who don't often attend events like this and are not entirely sure what to do with their hands. Margaret and her husband. The schoolteacher who was also named Eleanor, which Abigail had decided to take as something other than coincidence. A handful of neighbors who had come because they wanted to, and whose wanting to said something about what the Mercer Ranch had become in the community over the past 6 months. And her 4 sons. They stood together, the 4 of them on Luke's side of the arch. Ethan had built, Abigail had suggested this, and Luke had agreed immediately because they were becoming his family today, and that was where they belonged. Noah was wearing his best shirt and had his hair combed flat with a thoroughness that suggested significant effort, and he was holding a small bunch of the meadow flowers he had cataloged with Cade's color assistance. And his face had the expression of someone who has worked toward something for a long time, and is now watching it happen and is deeply quietly satisfied. Jacob was standing still, which was so unusual that Dutch had already looked at him twice to confirm it was actually Jacob. His stillness had a quality to it, the stillness of someone who understands that this moment is one of the ones you remember, and is making the decision to be present for all of it. Samuel had his hands clasped behind his back in the posture he adopted when he was paying close attention to something, and wanted to be sure he retained it accurately. He was watching everything with those cataloging eyes, filing it, keeping it. Ethan stood at the end, tallest, straightest, with his jaw set in the way it set when he was holding something carefully. He caught Abigail's eye as she came through the door, and something crossed his face, something that had his father in it, and something that was entirely his own, and something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He nodded. She nodded back. Then she walked toward Luke. The minister was a practical man who kept the words to what mattered, which was exactly what both of them had asked for. He spoke about commitment, and about building, and about the particular courage of people who have been through loss and chosen to love again anyway. He didn't make it long. He made it true. When he asked Luke if he would take Abigail as his wife, Luke looked at her directly and said, "I will have tea." With the same quality he brought to everything that mattered quietly without performance, with his whole attention on her. When he asked Abigail if she would take Luke as her husband, she said, "I will." And she meant every letter of both words in a way that went down to the foundation of herself. Noah, standing behind Luke, said very quietly, but not quietly enough, "Good." There was a sound from the assembled guests that was almost a laugh. Luke's mouth moved. He kept his eyes on Abigail. "Good," he said softly, echoing Noah. The minister finished. Luke took her hands and held them with both of his, and looked at her the way he had started looking at her somewhere around December, when he stopped pretending he wasn't looking at her that way. And Abigail looked back at him and felt the specific, hard-earned, entirely real joy of someone who has arrived somewhere true. He kissed her. Cade started clapping first, with the deliberate cadence of a man who has decided this is worth his full participation. Dutch followed immediately louder. Margaret's husband put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle that startled 3 of the horses. The schoolteacher applauded with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting a considerable time for this outcome. Jacob let out a sound that could only be described as a victory cry, which made everyone, including the minister, laugh. Noah ran forward and wrapped both arms around Luke's legs, and Luke, without breaking his hold on Abigail's hands, looked down at him and said, "Hey, partner," in a voice that was not entirely steady, and Noah looked up at him with those 6-year-old eyes that had always understood more than they should. "Can I call you Pa now?" Noah said. The yard went quiet. Luke looked at the boy. He looked at Abigail. She gave him nothing. This was his to answer his alone, and she waited. He crouched down to Noah's level. "Yeah," he said. "You can call me Pa." Noah considered this for approximately 1 second. Then he said, "Okay, Pa," with the complete simplicity of someone for whom this has always been the right word, and who has simply been waiting for permission to use it. Luke put his hand on the boy's head and stood back up. Ethan was watching from where he stood. His face was, she looked at it carefully, her oldest, her guarded one. His face was open, fully open, in a way she hadn't seen since he was 12 years old, and Robert was still alive, and the weight of the world hadn't yet decided to land on a teenager's shoulders. He wasn't crying. Ethan Harper did not cry. But his eyes were bright, and his jaw was loose, and when Luke caught his eye across the yard, Ethan walked forward. He stopped in front of Luke. He put out his hand. Luke took it. They shook hands. Not the handshake of a suspicious boy measuring a stranger. Not the handshake of an employee and an employer, but the handshake of 2 people who have worked alongside each other in hard conditions and come through them and know what the other person is made of. "Welcome to the family," Ethan said. His voice didn't waver. Luke held his hand for 1 extra beat. "Thank you, son," he said. Ethan nodded. He stepped back. He crossed his arms and looked at the ground for a moment, and then looked up at the sky, and then back at the company generally, and his face had moved back toward its usual composed expression. But it was a different composition now. Something had settled in it that hadn't been there before. Something that looked, Abigail thought, very much like rest. Samuel shook Luke's hand next, formally, precisely, as though completing an official transaction. "I expect you to keep your word about the law school conversation," he said. Luke kept a straight face. "I intend to." "Good," Samuel said. He stepped back. Jacob's handshake involved his entire upper body and a sound effect that no one could adequately explain, but that conveyed significant enthusiasm. "Can I still name the cats?" he asked. "You've been naming the cats since October," Luke said. "I don't think I could stop you if I tried." "Sheriff is going to have kittens again," Jacob said. "I'm going to need naming consultation." "I'll be available," Luke said. Jacob pointed at him with both hands. "Outstanding." The food was good. Jacob's negotiations with the hotel cook had produced a cake that was, by reasonable consensus, the finest thing that had been eaten on the Mercer Ranch in living memory, possibly in its entire history. Cade ate 3 pieces and denied having done so. Dutch ate 4 and did not deny it. Noah ate 1 very large piece very slowly, giving it the full deliberate attention it deserved. People talked. People laughed. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons move, with the quality of something that doesn't need to be hurried because it's already everything it needs to be. At one point, Abigail found herself standing slightly apart from the gathering, holding her coffee and watching her sons, the ranch hands, who had become something like family. The neighbors who had shown up because they wanted to. And she let herself do the thing she had not always let herself do, which was to simply stand in the middle of what she had and feel the full weight of it, not analyzing it, not cataloging the risks still remaining, or the work still to be done, or the places where things could still go wrong. Just standing in it. Margaret appeared beside her. "Well," Margaret said. She didn't say anything else. "Well," Abigail agreed. Margaret touched her arm briefly and went back to the gathering. Later, much later after the guests had gone, and Dutch had taken Cade back to the bunkhouse, supporting him with the patient tolerance of a younger man managing an older one who had perhaps celebrated with more conviction than his constitution could comfortably support. And after Jacob had been retrieved from the hayloft, where he had taken a piece of cake for what he described as contemplative purposes, and after Samuel had gone upstairs with his notebook, and Noah had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, exactly as he had fallen asleep on Luke's lap 6 months ago, on an evening that had changed the direction of several lives later in the kitchen, it was just the 2 of them. Luke was at the table. She was making the last of the coffee because she always made coffee, and tonight she wanted to do it because she wanted to, not because someone needed it. He said, "Come here." She brought the coffee and sat down. He put both hands around his cup and looked at her across the table. This table where they had worked through ledgers and written letters and built the case against a man who had underestimated what happened when people who had nothing to lose decided they weren't going to lose anything more. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When Eleanor died," he said, "I thought that was the end of something. I thought the life I'd been building was finished, and what came after would just be maintenance. Keeping things running, honoring what had been." He paused. "I didn't think there would be a new thing. I'd stopped expecting a new thing." She was quiet. "You're a new thing," he said. "You and those 4 boys. What's happening here? What's been happening since October? This isn't a continuation of something old. This is its own thing." He looked at her. "I want you to know I understand that. I'm not holding on to the past in a way that takes something from the present. Eleanor she'll always be part of this place, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But what you and I have is its own. I don't want you to ever feel like you're living in someone else's story." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "Luke," she said. "Yeah. I hung her curtains," she said. "I did that on purpose. I would do it again." She held his eyes. "She made you and this place into what I found when I got here. I'm not competing with that. I never was." She paused. "We're building something that includes her, and includes Robert, and includes everything those losses cost us, and everything they taught us. That's not a burden. That's the foundation." He looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor would have been insufferably pleased with herself," he said finally, "for having planted that garden." Abigail laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one, or a managed one, the kind that comes from deep enough that it surprises you on the way out. Luke smiled, watching it, the full smile, the one that had started as almost, and had become the real thing over 6 months of earning. "She sounds like she was worth being insufferable," Abigail said. "She was," he said. "She really was." They sat with that for a while. Comfortable. No gaps to manage. Then she said, "Samuel is going to be a lawyer." "I know." "He's going to be a formidable one." "I know that too." "Ethan is going to want to run this ranch eventually." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm counting on it." She looked at him. "I don't have sons of my own," he said. "I didn't, Eleanor and I. It didn't happen for us the way we'd hoped. I made my peace with that a long time ago." He looked at the table. "Ethan knows this land. He loves it the way you love something you've chosen, not just something you inherited. That matters differently. That matters more, maybe." He looked up. "I want to build this ranch into something worth leaving to him, something worth the work he's already put in." Abigail thought about her oldest son, who had crossed his arms in a doorway in Colorado Springs, and said he could be anyone, and who had said sir without being asked, and who had built an arch with his own hands and shaken Luke's hand and said, "Welcome to the family," with a voice that didn't waver. "He'll work himself half to death for this place," she said. "I know," Luke said. "I'm going to make sure it's worth it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Noah's going to call you Pa every single day for the rest of your life," she said. He turned his hand under hers and held it. "Good," he said. "Jacob is going to name every animal on this ranch." "I've accepted that." "He's going to name your horse." "My horse has a name." "Had," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood something and is not entirely sure how he feels about it. "What did he name him?" "General," she said. "A beat. The horse's name is already—" "I know," she said. "It's already." "Luke." He stopped. "Let him name the horse," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "The horse's name is General," he said. "That's very reasonable of you," she said. "I'm a reasonable man." "You are," she agreed. The fire was burning low. The coffee was warm. Outside, the May night had settled over the Mercer Ranch with the particular quality of Wyoming spring nights, cool and clean, carrying the smell of grass coming back, and the distant sound of cattle settled and content. Abigail thought about October, about a train platform and a trunk with a broken latch, and 4 boys lined up in the wind, and a man who touched the brim of his hat and didn't flinch. She thought about the 14 letters, the 12 silences, the 1 cruel line. She thought about 3 paragraphs that had changed everything. She thought about what it cost to be honest when honesty felt like risk, and what honesty had returned to her, compounded by every month of a Wyoming winter, and every evening at this table, and every morning with coffee started before anyone else was awake. She looked at her husband. He looked at her. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be built was being built. The boys were upstairs, all 4 of them, under the roof of a house that was theirs. Now not borrowed, not provisional, not contingent on anyone else's approval or anyone else's patience running out. Theirs. Fully and permanently theirs. She squeezed Luke's hand once and let it go and stood up to put the coffee cups away, and he stood up too and banked the fire for the night, and they moved around that kitchen together in the easy way of people who have learned each other's rhythms, who know without asking where the other one is going to be and what the other one is going to need, who have built the ordinary architecture of a shared life out of months of small, honest moments. This was the thing that the town of Cheyenne had not been able to see when it looked at a fat widow with 4 boys and a lonely rancher and a practical arrangement that suited no one's idea of romance. It did not know what it was looking at. It was looking at 2 people who had been broken open by loss and had chosen with full knowledge of the cost of choosing to build something new from what remained. It was looking at 4 boys who had arrived on a train platform with nothing but each other and their mother's stubborn spine, and who had become through work and trust and the particular alchemy of people who need each other and are honest about it, the sons of a Wyoming rancher who had been waiting for them without knowing he was waiting. It was looking at a ranch that had survived for years and had finally, in the way of things that have only been waiting for the right people, begun to live. Years from now, people in Cheyenne would tell the story of the Mercer Ranch. They would talk about the legal fight about the evidence that brought down Charles Whitmore and freed 3 other families from his long reach. They would talk about the hard winter and the blizzard and the boys who rode out into it. They would talk about the widow who came from Colorado with 4 sons and nothing else, and turned a cold house into a home that people were glad to be invited to. Some of them would say Luke Mercer saved her. They would be wrong about that. What actually happened was this: a woman who had been told in 12 different silences that she was too much, too big, too poor, too complicated, too burdened, walked onto a platform in Cheyenne with her spine straight and her chin up, and found a man who looked at everything she came with and said, "Good." She saved him right back. And the 4 boys who stood behind her on that platform, the one who built things with his hands, and the one who found truth in numbers, and the one who named everything he loved, and the one who had always known where home was, they did not arrive as burdens. They arrived as the best part of the whole arrangement. They arrived as the family this ranch had always been waiting to become.